beloved taxi driver,
Raphael was a hardworking guy. He always tried to do better and better and better.
is murdered in cold blood.
That's when they observed a body inside of the trunk.
There were 9 gunshots. That's not an accident.
We had no leads, we had no suspects, had no idea who could have done this to him.
Police uncover a sinister trail of motives.
A lot of people was jealous of Raphael.
Raphael tended to like the ladies a little bit.
Raphael had approximately $2,000 in his vehicle.
But struggle to find suspects.
People were asking, do we have to be scared? Is there a murder out there killing us Hispanics?
We noticed on his license plate of his vehicle, there appeared to be a blood stain.
Until the bizarre truth turns the case on its head.
We're calling him through the loudspeaker, trying to get him to come out of the house, which turned into an hours-long standoff.
When that fingerprint came back with a second person, it really blew it wide open.
We knew he was at the scene.
That was a bombshell. That was a game changer in terms of the criminal prosecution. Ultimately, to come back to these 2 people was something that we never saw coming.
Rogers County, Oklahoma, a quiet rural district north of Tulsa's city limits.
Rogers County is just a great, tight-knit community.
It's a agricultural community, a very wholesome, family-oriented community.
That all changes in the early hours of May 1st, 2015, when a truck driver sees something unusual beneath a bridge.
Our dispatch center received a call of a vehicle partially submerged in the Caney River off Highway 169.
Police and firefighters arrive at the scene in minutes and cordon off the area. Emergency crews check to see if anyone is trapped inside.
The news media was there, and it was being broadcasted over live TV.
As the car is towed onto the riverbank, its trunk pops open.
That's when they initially observed a body inside of the trunk.
At that point, we knew we had a serious crime at hand.
Rogers County Sheriff's detectives arrive and begin their investigation.
When I arrived on scene, I observed a Hispanic male inside of the trunk.
These pockets look like they've been rummaged through.
Only when detectives move the victim's shirt do they realize the violent nature of the attack.
He appeared to have several gunshot wounds to his chest area.
There were 9 gunshots. That's not an accident. 9 gunshots is intentional.
Somebody wanted to make sure that he did not survive his injuries.
The first question facing detectives is who is the man in the trunk?
We did not locate any type of identification or any wallet or anything that a normal person would have in his pockets.
So it made it very hard for us to identify who he was. We were taking photographs of his tattoos and unique markings on his body.
Inside of the vehicle, we found some cell phones.
As the car was submerged, we got lucky that one of the cell phones was placed on the dash and it was fully intact, still operational.
The detectives and forensics team comb the riverbank for further clues.
We noticed a large amount of blood, and we suspected that was the area that the victim was initially shot. Well, near that pool of blood, we also found some shell casings consistent with the size of bullet wounds inside the deceased's body.
A few feet away, detectives notice more clues.
There were several beer cans and a cigarette butt and a piece of tissue.
I was told that a family member had showed up and seen his brother's car on the news, and he said, yes, that's my brother's car.
The young man's brother is Rafael Hernandez Torres, a taxi owner serving customers in Tulsa's Hispanic community.
I showed him a photograph of a tattoo that I had taken from the victim's body. That Oscar immediately identified the tattoo belonging to his brother and then began sobbing and crying because at that point we told him that his brother had been murdered.
it broke my heart. When I seen the pictures, it felt like the whole world just kind of ended.
Oscar called me. When I found out Rafael got shot, I didn't even know how to react. I was just shocked. I was like, how?
Rafael Hernandez Torres was born outside Mexico City on October 22, 1976.
As a kid, he was a rebel.
Growing up, he was always riding his bike from town to town.
He loved to go and get to know people from other places, get to know other cities. He just loved to travel everywhere.
When Rafael was 20 years old, his parents moved him and his siblings to the U.S. As one of the oldest sons, Rafael helped support the family.
It was difficult to move to a different place that we didn't know, and we had to start from zero.
Rafael was the big brother. And as soon as we got here, Rafael told us to get straight to school, learn the language, and just keep on going. Rafael was a hardworking guy. He always tried to do better and better and better.
As a young man, Rafael's warm personality attracted others.
He was so friendly with everyone, especially ladies.
Rafael was enterprising too, turning his passion for travel into a career.
Rafael started his taxi business with one car. From there, it kept on going and going.
Rafael was known in Tulsa's Hispanic community as someone willing to help anyone in need.
Rafael cared about everybody. If he saw you down, he'll try to help you. If he saw you homeless, he'll get you a room and get you a shower and help you out.
He knew people who didn't have anything to eat, and he helped them out. Rafael had a great heart.
What would lead anyone to take Rafael's life so violently on that riverbank?
Everybody knew him. Everybody liked him. He did a service to his community, always gave back to his community. At this point, we're thinking, why would somebody kill him?
At the crime scene, detectives ask Oscar and Juan what they know about Rafael's last hours before his body was discovered in the river.
Rafael called me and told me that he was going to Texas, but the next day he didn't call me, which was strange because he was always calling me every time he went out of state.
Police ask if Oscar and Juan know why anyone might want to kill their brother.
We learned that Rafael was known to carry approximately $2,000 on him at all times.
Whoever did this took his ID, took his wallet, took any money he may have had. So that led to the possible motive that Rafael had been killed for the money.
Oscar gives the detectives one more useful piece of information.
Oscar told us that some of Rafael's vehicles had been vandalized where Rafael ran his business.
A lot of people was jealous of Rafael because he was really successful in the business that he was doing.
Had the beloved taxi driver made a lethal enemy in his community?
We had no leads, we had no suspects, had no idea who could have done this to him.
This wasn't just a disagreement or something. It was a very violent act.
I had a lot of questions about Rafael. Why? Who? Why would they kill him? What did he do?
This is not a random killing. This is someone who targeted Rafael and wanted him to die.
Coming up, detectives uncover a tangled web of romantic interests.
Not only does he call her frequently and go by and see her, but I know he bought her flowers.
She had an unusual relationship with her ex-husband. They both still slept in the same bed.
So a scorned husband, that could fit right in with that. Now we're starting to think this could be a motive.
And a surprising lead sends the case in a new direction.
We were shocked when we found a second individual's fingerprint at the scene.
After discovering Rafael Hernandez Torres shot dead and stuffed into the trunk of his own taxicab, detectives are trying to establish if it was a robbery gone wrong or if he'd been targeted by someone with a grudge.
We were trying to see if we could locate who had vandalize Raphael's vehicles, see if there's anyone that had a motive or a reason to harm or murder Raphael.
Detectives are also on the lookout for vehicles spotted near the bridge on the night of the murder.
We established a tip line, and we got that number out to the news outlets.
We received multiple tips from passerbys describing that they saw a truck on the side of the highway, a black SUV on the side of the highway, and then a silver car on the side of the highway.
So we initially started looking for vehicles that could match that description in the hopes that we could run a name.
Next, investigators head to the heart of Tulsa's Latino district, where Raphael based his business.
The area of 21st and Garnett in Tulsa is a predominantly Latino community. Right at the heart of that is Santa Cecilia Plaza.
There's grocery stores, there's hair salons, ice cream parlors, where the Hispanic community gathers with their families.
The Plaza Santa Cecilia, it's a place to go if you're Hispanic most of the time. Something's always happening.
Raphael parked his vehicles outside of the Mercandito and also right next to the ice cream shop.
Raphael spent every day walking around talking to these people.
Raphael gave rides to people that needed them. He helped translate, and he's just well known in his community as a person always giving back and helping. Very kind and loving person.
Raphael always said that's what he loved to do. He loved, helping out people.
Detectives canvass Raphael's friends at the plaza.
They were shocked that he was murdered and killed. And they were heartbroken.
Was there anyone who had a reason to want him dead?
It was well known in that community that Raphael had money, that he carried money with him.
We spoke with Roman, who was considered a maintenance man around the area.
We spoke with Felipe, who owned a grocery store, as well as Adon, who ran the ice cream cart.
Adon came into contact with Raphael multiple times in a week as he pushed that cart up and down those businesses.
We actually learned that people seemed to really like Raphael. No one really seemed to have a motive to want to harm him.
As detectives continue searching the plaza for leads, they gain access to Raphael's cell phone records.
So initially, we had the physical phone. I drafted a search warrant to try to extract as much data as possible from that phone. Raphael was talking to multiple people between 9:15 and 9:30. So we know that he's alive at that point, or he wouldn't be answering his phone. And then after that time period, he doesn't answer any more phone calls.
It's always important when someone has been murdered to find out who they talked to last. One of the numbers that we had identified on Raphael's phone belonged to a female named Letty. Letty worked at a laundromat near where Raphael kept his vehicles. We found out through Oscar that Raphael and Letty may have had some type of relationship. Raphael would frequent Letty's place of business at the laundromat and would go by to see her.
Not only does he call her frequently and go by and see her, but I know he bought her flowers. He took little gifts up to her. He took her to Dallas one time for one of his fairs. They drove to Dallas and then drove right back.
There's one more thing about Letty that gets the officers' attention.
We also discovered that Letty was married.
As officers dig into this new lead, Raphael's autopsy results come in.
Raphael was shot 3 times in the front and 6 times in the back.
There's a mindset behind somebody shooting somebody that many times. It tells you that this is a crime of passion. It's not just something that just happened.
So a scorned husband, that could fit right in with that. Now we're starting to think this could be a motive.
Had Letty's husband killed Raphael in a jealous rage? Detectives decide to get some answers from Letty.
So we went to interview Letty, and Letty was not very forthcoming.
We had talked to her about her relationship with Raphael. What is that? What is that relationship? She told us that they were just friends.
Letty did deny being in a relationship with Raphael.
We learned after speaking with Letty that she had not been truthful to us. She did not provide a correct date of birth, did not provide her correct address.
At the station, detectives searched Letty's name in the police database.
We later learned Letty's true address and her true date of birth. In doing so, we discovered that Letty had an outstanding warrant.
So obviously, we're on high alert with her because she's trying to deceive us.
Knowing that we've been lied to, we want to observe Letty's comings and goings, so we'd start conducting surveillance on Letty's home.
As detectives stake out Letty's home, their attention is drawn to a vehicle.
As we arrived, we saw a vehicle pull in that was almost an exact match to one of them mentioned in the tip line.
He's driving a black truck with a silver stripe on the back of it. And that was a possible vehicle we were looking for.
Detectives investigating the shooting of taxi driver Rafael Hernandez Torres believe his friendship with laundromat worker Letty could have sent her husband into a jealous rage.
The first thing we decided to do when looking into Letty and her husband was we went to see who her husband's talking to.
Then a truck pulls up in Letty's driveway that matches a vehicle spotted near the scene of Rafael's murder.
So from there, we decided that we're going to make contact with the individual in the truck.
Officers confront the truck's owner, who claims to be the friend of Letty's husband, Mario.
Rogelio was basically crashing on Mario and Letty's couch, and they were putting him up for several weeks.
While speaking with Rogelio, we noticed on his license plate of his vehicle that there appeared to be a blood stain.
And there's a bloody fingerprint on the tag of the truck. Looking under the truck, and there's a piece of tissue that is kind of consistent with tissue that we found at the scene.
Is this the evidence detectives have been searching for? They search the house and see what else they can find.
During the search of that home, we did find a firearm inside the home. We submitted that to the state crime lab.
We had a victim that had been killed, put into the trunk of his vehicle, and then that vehicle was subsequently pushed into the river. It was a very narrow window of time that all this happened in. So in most of the investigators' mind, it's a very good possibility that there's two people involved in this. Well, we got what we believe could be the possible vehicle. We have evidence that Letty's husband and this friend of his could be our suspects. And we're thinking this is the big crack to the case that we've been looking for.
Police bring Mario and Rogelio in for questioning. They ask Mario about Rafael. Had the taxi driver's advances on Letty made him a target?
Mario was familiar with that Rafael had bought his wife flowers and was known to stop by her place of business frequently, but he did not seem to be very upset by that.
Mario insists that he was never jealous of Rafael because he and Letty are divorced.
We discovered that Letty had an unusual relationship with her ex-husband. They both still lived in the same house. They lived there with their children. They even slept in the same bed.
She was kind of out seeing people. He didn't care.
Mario also insists that he was at home asleep on the night of the murder. Rogelio gives the same alibi, insisting that he never left the house that night.
Their alibis were not really solid. We were worried about them being co-conspirators, so at the time, we weren't putting just a whole lot of stock into that.
Officers press Rogelio about the blood on his license plate.
But we talked to him about the blood on it, and he's got a good excuse for that. He cut his finger trying to put the tag on, and the bloody fingerprint is his blood. They were more than willing to provide their DNA and fingerprints to clear themselves.
Despite officers' suspicion of Mario and Rogelio, the lab results tell a different story.
We have DNA from the scene, and Rogelio and Mario don't possess that DNA.
The firearm inside the home did not match bullets that we found in Rafael.
And based on their phone numbers, they weren't at the scene. We found zero evidence linking them to the crime, and that whole theory really started to fall apart quick. We were going back to the drawing board and we were starting over again.
We weren't sure on where to go from here other than talking to the community. It was very frustrating during this point.
With each passing day, pressure to solve the case is only increasing.
People were asking, do we have to be scared? Is there a murder out there killing us Hispanics?
My whole family was worried because they didn't want me doing the taxing business because they didn't want me to be the same as my brother.
At a crossroads in the investigation, police find a new way forward when they gain access to further cell phone records from the night of the murder.
One of the last contacts that Rafael had was a fare that was supposed to be getting a ride to Texas later that night, and Rafael never showed up.
But there's one other number that we know is also communicating with Rafael at around the time of his death.
Rafael was scheduled to pick up an individual and told him that he was going to be late because he had another job.
Rafael had told him that he was going to help a friend who had gotten into an accident, and he was going to go translate for him to the police. We know that phone conversation took place around 9:15, and we believe that around 9:35 that Rafael was murdered.
Had Rafael been lured to his death by a call from someone he knew?
As we start diving into the call detail records on that phone number, we're able to follow the tower information and the location of that phone to the scene of the crime.
We were able to track Rafael's phone and the suspect phone, both going to the same area. However, Rafael's phone didn't leave, and the suspect phone went back to Tulsa.
This was very important to us because we knew that this was the possible killer that enticed Rafael to where he ultimately was shot and killed.
That's when we make the decision to focus everything on that number.
When police try to identify the phone's owner, there's a problem.
We get subscriber information for the phone number, and it comes back to a fictitious name.
The number was on a prepaid phone. It wasn't attached to any particular person.
That number was very important to us, especially after seeing the lengths that the individual went to hide their identity. We felt very strong that this number was going to belong to the killer.
So investigators had to start looking at other ways of identifying who this phone belonged to.
We started to get call detail records for that number.
And they started contacting people that were in contact with the cell phone.
We were able to pinpoint a phone number from someone that talked to the suspect phone several times close to the time of the killing.
The phone number belongs to a man named Marco Lara.
But once we got the name from Marco Lara, we started running a criminal history check, and we find drug charges, some firearms charges, stuff that we were interested in when you're looking for a violent killer. We knew that Marco knew who possessed our bad guy's phone number because he had been calling it.
Marco ran with some of the same people in that area that Rafael had contact with. And so we really felt like Marco was going to be a good spot to gain some information.
We went to the area of the plaza. Marco lived one street over, and we staked out his house. We saw a truck pull into his driveway, and he gets out of the driver's seat, and he walks into the house. So we get out, and we start covering exits to make sure that he isn't leaving. But that's when things went south.
2 weeks after cab driver Rafael Hernandez Torres is found shot dead in the trunk of his car, police are about to confront Marco Lara, a man they believe may know the identity of the killer.
We went there to make contact with Marco. He refused to come to the door.
We're calling him out through the loudspeaker, trying to get him to come out of the house, which turned into a standoff. We established a phone connection. There was a woman and children in the house, his family, and we're requesting for him to come out. And this goes on for a long time. Eventually, his wife and children come out, and we believe, that it's just him in the home.
There was a several-hour standoff with him in which he ultimately gave up and came outside and surrendered.
Police take Marco into custody and begin their interrogation.
Initially, we were thinking, this is a bad guy. He's got criminal history. He's actively resisting us coming and arresting him. We're thinking, okay, this could very well be an associate of our killer, if not possibly involved.
But cell tower phone records prove otherwise.
But once we got him arrested, we were able to determine that his phone as well had not traveled to the area where Rafael was killed.
If Marco is not involved, then why had he resisted arrest?
He has an outstanding warrant.
He's doing whatever he can to keep from going to jail.
No longer a direct suspect, Marco still has information valuable to the investigation.
So we had seized his phone. We had his phone. I typed in our suspect's number, and he said, that's him.
That number belonged to Roman Medrano, who lived in Tulsa.
Marco provided us the apartment complex that Roman lived at.
So knowing that Roman Medrano was the owner of that phone, we sat at the apartment complex and we figured out what apartment he was in.
And the next morning, we served a search warrant on that apartment.
When detectives search the apartment where Roman Medrano lives with his wife Blanca, they're surprised by what they find.
As we entered the residence, I noticed there was no furniture. It appeared that Roman maybe didn't have a lot of money. Maybe he was struggling to pay his bills.
We find that there's very little in the way of furniture, and it looks like things are being sold off. There's IRS paperwork scattered about.
Searching through Blanca's purse, officers make a discovery that raises their suspicions further.
There was approximately $2,000 in her purse. Rafael had approximately $2,000, in his vehicle. And now our suspect's wife has this large sum of money in her purse that is pretty close to the amount.
We had the one suspect number that we had determined to belong to Roman Medrano. At that point, we felt we had enough to bring Roman and his wife in for questioning.
At the police station, detectives first interview Roman's wife, Blanca.
Blanca initially denied knowing who Rafael was.
Blanca told us that she was not given a ride by Rafael, that Roman has nothing to do with this.
Then how to explain the $2,000 in her purse?
Roman doesn't have any money. He's worried about losing his roof over his head. It's well known in the community that Rafael carries lots of cash with him. So I don't think it was any secret that by killing Rafael that Roman could get a payday out of that. Blanca basically told us that Roman was with her the night of the homicide, that he's always home.
In another interview room, detectives question Roman.
Roman told us that he did not know Rafael, that he didn't know that his wife knew Rafael, that he had never been to the area where the homicide occurred. Roman denied every aspect of any knowledge of the case whatsoever.
Roman just heard of Rafael's taxi service and that he was, doing work in the Hispanic community.
But detectives have information that suggests a closer connection.
Shortly after the first interview with Marco, he reached out to us and gave us more information about Roman. Marco told us that he had overheard Roman and another individual talking about how Rafael had given Roman's wife, Blanca, a ride in this taxi cab to the Tulsa County Jail.
Pressed further, Roman admits to knowing more about Rafael than he first let on.
Rafael had a successful business and tended to like the ladies a little bit.
Roman did not like the fact that she was taking rides with Rafael.
He still wasn't willing to tell us that he was, at the scene of the crime.
Confronted with Roman's admission that she'd taken rides with Rafael, Blanca's story begins to change.
Now she knows Rafael. She's telling us that they had talked, they knew of each other.
Blanca began to tell us that during one of her rides with Rafael, that he came on to her and that she believed that it was inappropriate and told Roman about it.
We had learned that Rafael had made comments to Blanca as trying to hit on her. and that this was very upsetting to Roman. Blanca described Roman as a very jealous man.
Had something happened between Rafael and Blanca that triggered Roman to seek revenge?
Based on how many times they were shot, and there was a personal element to this, we believe that Rafael's conduct towards Roman's wife could have been a motive to kill him. At this point in the investigation, we definitely feel like we have our guy.
"17 days after Rafael Hernandez Torres' murder, police are investigating husband and wife Roman and Blanca Medrano.
There were two angles that led us to Roman. One was jealousy. We knew that Roman was aware of Rafael giving a ride to Blanca.
Roman believed that Rafael disrespected his wife by coming on to her as she described, which would indicate a motive behind Rafael's killing.
But we also knew that Roman was struggling financially. And we had every reason to believe that Roman would know that Rafael carried money with him.
We definitely feel like we've got probable cause to arrest him. We feel like we have our guy. We don't know if there's another individual at this point, but we know we've got at least one of them.
Under questioning, the couple remains adamant in their denials.
Roman would never come out and tell us the truth.
Roman told us that he had never been to the area where the homicide occurred. Blanca gives us an alibi for Roman and says that he's at the house with her. We knew that wasn't true because it was Roman's cell phone that was at the scene. We got the overlay of suspect location from the cell towers. We knew the possessor of that phone was involved in this killing.
Was it possible that someone else had Roman's phone on the night of the murder?
We had the evidence from the cell phone that Roman talked to Blanca 20 times the night of the homicide. If you're sitting right next to him, why are you calling him that many times? And she says, I'm not. So things kind of started to change. Now we have actual evidence from, the mouth of his own wife that what he's saying isn't true. So to this point, we have a very compelling circumstantial case. We've got the cell phone records. We have motive.
Police take Roman's fingerprints and swab him for DNA.
And then we get the information back from their crime lab, and we find DNA from the scene on a beer bottle that belongs to Roman Medrano.
The DNA evidence that came back to Roman Medrano really firmed up the case against him. It went from a very circumstantial case to a really good case.
Police are ready to charge Roman with murder, but know the case is far from airtight.
There was no murder weapon. We didn't have an eyewitness to it. We knew that proving it in court was going to be very difficult to do.
Then, as detectives go back carefully over forensic reports from the state crime lab, they find something unexpected.
We were shocked when we found a second individual's fingerprint at the scene.
When that fingerprint came back with a second person, it really blew it wide open.
This fingerprint affirmed our suspicion that there was more than one person involved in the killing.
That was a bombshell. That was a game changer in terms of the criminal prosecution, because now we had an eyewitness.
That print came back to a guy by the name of Adon Mora. Adon Mora was a member of the community there in the plaza.
This fingerprint came back from the Department of Homeland Security when Adon Mora was deported previously.
Adon Mora was known as the Ice Cream Man.
When I found out that the Ice Cream Man was involved, it was a shock because you don't expect someone to be that person.
Why would Rafael's friend, the ice cream vendor, turn against him?
We knew he was at the scene. We knew he knew the victim. We knew he knew the other suspect. Marco Lara told us that Adon and Roman were pretty tight. I mean, they spent a lot of time together.
The consensus amongst the investigators is that it was more than likely a two-reason motive. One, they were in dire straits, needing money, and 2, that Rafael had disrespected Roman in talking to his wife, Blanca. At that point, we issued a warrant for Adon Mora. However, we did not have a location as where he was at.
We spoke with an individual that told us that he had gotten scared about a criminal investigation and that he had went up north.
But we did find that he was on Facebook. We wrote a search warrant to Facebook, and Facebook provided us a probable location of Adon.
We were able to locate those IP addresses into a suburb of Detroit, Michigan. It gave us about a 3-block area.
Detectives contact U.S. Marshals, who take Adon into custody within a matter of hours.
I read Adon his rights. While speaking with him, he acted as if he was not close to Rafael in any way. When I asked him specifically if he had been to the area of the Caney River, he stopped the interview and requested that his attorney be present.
Hearing of Adon's arrest, Roman requests another interview with police.
During that interview, Roman was trying to give me scenarios where Adon had perpetrated this crime, and Roman was just trying to give him a ride, had no idea what was going on.
Told that Roman has pinned the blame on him, Adon decides to cooperate and tell his side of the story.
Adon eventually agrees to speak with us and said that Roman had owed him money and that he had a way to get him his money back.
Adon says that the night of the homicide, Roman tells him that he needs Adon to come with him and that he was going to get him the money. So Adon gets in the vehicle with Roman. Roman stops. They get a pack of beer and they drive down to the riverbank of the Caney River.
Had Adon just signed on to help Roman kill Rafael? If so, which one of them fired the gun?
There's a lot of things that we don't know at this point.
We had 2 people that we could put at the crime scene, but we didn't know who the trigger man was.
We felt confident that we could prove that Roman Medrano was there and was a part of the crime, but Roman was trying to give me scenarios where Adon had perpetrated this crime. Adon is doing his best he can to separate himself from the crime.
It's extremely important for the family members that we get justice for them. This was an incredibly violent crime, and we wanted the person that pulled that trigger.
When I found out Rafael was lured out because someone needed help, it was just horrible. Why would you lie to him like that?
We wanted a conviction for the community, for the family, so we requested that Adon take a polygraph. There's no way that we can give Rafael back, but what we can do is solve the crime and send the perpetrators to prison.
Police now have 2 suspects in custody for the shooting of Rafael Hernandez Torres, Roman Medrano, and Adon Mora Ramos.
Ultimately, to come back to these 2 people was something that we never saw coming.
Adon's unexpected involvement in the murder gives police a valuable way to secure a conviction. To ensure he's telling the truth, police have Adon submit to a polygraph test.
During the interview with Adon, he explained to us that Roman wanted him to be at a certain location to help him with a job of some sort.
They went out to the area where the homicide had occurred, and they were there drinking some beer and just hanging out.
Adon doesn't really know what's going on. He's asking Roman, what are we doing? How are we going to get this money? Well, Roman keeps walking off, and he's on the phone. He makes a phone call where Adon can't hear him. After a period of time, Adon sees Rafael's silver car pulling down where they're at.
Rafael believed that he was going to help a friend who had gotten into an accident.
It was Roman's cell phone that made the call to lure Rafael out to the rural secluded area.
According to Adon, Rafael drank a few beers with them, and then Roman asked for his help jump-starting his car.
Roman directed Rafael's vehicle to pull down and give him a jump. Roman tells Adon to take the jumper cables and hook them up to the cars.
Adon tells investigators that what happened next took him by surprise.
Adon is trying to hook up the cables under the hood of the car, and he hears the gunshots. He looks up and says that he sees Roman standing over Rafael, and that Rafael has been shot several times. Adon fingers Roman as the triggerman, as the actual killer.
The polygraph test confirms that Adon is telling the truth.
That was the last piece of evidence that we needed. The information that he gave was truthful. And it became clear that Roman was really the one that had a personal vendetta against Rafael and the financial motive for it. But we knew Adon participated. We knew he helped out with it. Adon admitted that he put Rafael's body in the trunk and helped push the vehicle into the river. And Adon said he was afraid that Roman was going to shoot him as well.
Adon never says anything about the money. Adon just says he's worried that he's going to be next. Now, he's a witness to this crime.
And so Adon, because of that fear, fled the area shortly after the crime had happened. Ultimately, we charged Adon with accessory and gave him a 15-year sentence. Adon was there. He could have stopped this, and he didn't. He could have cooperated, and he didn't. So he needed to go to prison. Roman entered a plea of no contest to murder in the first degree, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole.
When this investigation started, it was a true whodunit. We weren't certain on who was involved or why they would want Rafael killed.
For such a violent act to be committed over a couple $1,000s and an offhand comment to Roman's wife is unexplainable.
It was a cruel and unusual way of getting back at somebody for being jealous and wanting the things that he had.
Rafael was a generous man, a benevolent man, and they took advantage of that. They knew that he would be willing to help them, and they used that good nature against him and ultimately lured him out there and murdered him.
My whole family feel relieved because we finally got justice from my brother, Rafael, because his dad didn't go in vain.
My feeling and thought about these people was always like, why? Why? What problem did they have with Rafael? I don't know.
Today, the Hernandez-Torres family does everything they can to keep Rafael's memory alive.
Rafael was like a role model for everybody. He was the biggest role model for me because he showed me, even when I'm down, to always get up and fight for what I like.
We just love for Rafael to be remembered as a crazy, funny, flirtatious guy who thought of helping other people. It's always something or someone who remembers Rafael and talk about his life, and we just all start crying. And we wish he was still here, but he's still with us.
An ambitious young woman loved by the community.
Everyone was friends with Terry.
She was hardworking, had 2 jobs.
By 21, she owned a home.
Has her future ripped away.
This was a particularly brutal attack.
They stabbed her multiple times on that road.
This would have been a horrifying death.
Police discover unwanted admirers prone to violence.
He was covered in blood and had blood in his hair.
And always carrying a knife.
He was jealous and said that he'd kill her.
But the evidence leads nowhere.
The investigation is getting older and older and harder to solve.
I didn't think we were going to get an answer for this case.
Until a surprise breakthrough.
I was beyond excited. I actually shouted, "Oh my God," at my desk.
Points to a killer off the radar.
right away, I'm like, who's that guy?
Why? Why did someone do this?
People said, oh, no, he wouldn't kill anybody, but he had this pretend life.
He had no criminal record. He did not emerge as a likely suspect at all.
Germantown, Wisconsin, a sleepy village celebrated as one of the best places to live in America.
I grew up in Germantown. It's, a small community. I would ride my bike to the store for my mom. It was not someplace that you were afraid of.
Germantown is a small town near Milwaukee, a lot of farmland, a lot of open spaces, just a lot of dairy farming, some factories, and homes.
But on May 28, 1999, this bedroom community wakes to a horrific crime.
Yeah, we have a dead body up here on Upper River Lane. There's a green car there, green Pontiac car. She's laying by the curb. There's blood on the road.
I got a phone call that there was a suspected homicide in the industrial park. I immediately went to the crime scene. I saw a vehicle on the side of the road facing west, a large amount of blood in the roadway. I observed what appeared to be footwear impressions in blood. I saw what appeared to be drag marks of blood, 2 large pools of blood, and alongside the vehicle was a female lying face down. When we rolled her over, she had a significant number of what appeared to be stab wounds on her front. She had stab wounds on both sides of her neck.
She had some blood on her hands, and we're always hoping that there's a fight so she can either scratch the attacker. So the hands were swabbed for DNA.
We proceeded with the perspective. She may have not been expecting it, and things went south very, very fast. I do believe there was rage in this case.
That usually is indicative of personal, that they know each other, and it's almost to the point of overkill.
Who was this woman who had been so savagely murdered? Investigators looked to the victim's car for answers.
The vehicle itself appeared to be parked in a reasonable manner alongside the road.
Her car keys were by her body, so she probably had them when she got out of her car and then dropped them in the fight.
The keys indicated that she willingly got out of the vehicle and talked to someone, and then the homicide occurred. The stabbing continued not only in the roadway, but on the grass at 2 different locations, and then it looked like it may have occurred alongside the vehicle.
There's blood spatter and cast off on her wheel, on her hood, on her fender, and up on her windshield.
Her purse was in the vehicle. There was $200 in her purse.
This was not a robbery. This was something else.
After finding a driver's license, police determine the victim is 22-year-old Teresa Wesolowski.
Out on the road, there was tire acceleration marks leading away from the pool of blood in the roadway, as if you put your foot on the accelerator and peeled out, confirming to us that there was another vehicle in front of her where she was more than likely stabbed.
Police comb the crime scene, but no murder weapon is found. As detectives try to make sense of what happened to Teresa, her lifelong best friend Michelle gets a call.
Terry's brother called, and it was early. Not that it was out of the ordinary, because we were all so close. And so I answered, and he's like, Michelle, Terry never came home last night. Well, I'm going to start calling police departments. And Germantown said, we have her name on file. You'll have to come and speak to a detective.
Michelle and Teresa's brother rushed to the station. They had last seen Teresa the day before when she left for work.
I'll never forget, the officer was in front of me. And I said, where is she? And he said, I'm sorry, she's gone. And I just remember screaming. Someone just told me my friend is gone. What does gone mean?
Born in Germantown, Wisconsin, Teresa Wesolowski grew up an outgoing girl with a magnetic personality.
Everyone was friends with Terry. We became best friends in 6th grade, and from that moment on, we were inseparable. We were sisters. There were not many people that called her Teresa. She was always Terry. I think the only time that I remember her being called Teresa was when her mom was mad, when we had done something wrong. It was always just her and I on the playground. I mean, we were just always, I want to say, running the neighborhood, you know? I can't remember a weekend that I wasn't at her house.
As she got older, Teresa was fiercely independent, buying a car at 16 and moving out on her own at 18.
She was working at Cousins Subs in Mequon, and she would go there at 7 a.m., and she would get done by 1, and she would head over to Stone Container, and she would work till 11 o'clock at night.
Despite a heavy work schedule, Teresa loved to be social.
Oh, Terry was fun. You know, Terry liked attention, and she definitely liked the attention from men. Men just seemed more attracted to her. She was young, she was beautiful. Any guy would have wanted that.
How, then, did someone so driven and well-liked meet such a horrible fate?
Young female, you know, at the beginning of her life, getting things together, and it's ended.
Back at the station, investigators reach out to Teresa's family and friends to piece together the hours leading up to her death.
Her shift ended at 11, and the last that anybody saw of her that we know of was that she got into her vehicle and left that parking lot.
During the interviews, detectives get their first tip.
That morning, the officers received a contact from somebody at the Department of Public Works. They had a channel on the same radio system that the police department was on, so they would know that the homicide occurred. They indicated that somebody driving a truck pulled into the parking lot. An individual got out, and they said that he was covered in blood and had blood in his hair.
Is this man somehow connected to the crime scene? Detectives head over to interview the witnesses, who tell police they'd never seen the man before.
We were told the truck driver asked if there was a hospital nearby, and then he indicated now he'd just clean up in the bathroom, which he did, and then left.
It's very common that the person who's doing the attacking gets stabbed too or cuts himself, especially if there's a struggle. Now we had a suspect, a viable suspect, and now we needed to find that person to figure out what happened.
Coming up, detectives uncover suspects with violent tendencies.
He said he can cut people like paper. He could become abusive and violent.
And untangle a web of deception.
Well, he was never married. He didn't have any kids.
He said, I don't want to be a snitch.
Leading them to a suspect they never imagined.
We really felt that we had turned the corner on this case.
It was almost surreal. It got me because it wasn't anyone I knew.
Hours after finding Teresa Wesolowski stabbed to death at the side of the road, police search for a man seen covered in blood at a nearby public works building.
We had a very good police artist. He did a sketch of the individual based on the statements from the witnesses, put the word out there into the community.
While police wait for leads on the bloody man, they shift their attention to Teresa's home to look for clues.
I went down to Teresa's house. We made a search of the residence. I checked the shoes in the residence against the footwear impression at the crime scene, and none of them matched. So the footwear impression at the scene weren't Teresa's.
Investigators talked to Teresa's family and friends, hoping to learn more about her. They learned she was dating someone named Charlie.
Charlie was a young man who didn't hold down a lot of jobs very well. He was staying at his parents' house. They had been dating for a few months prior to her homicide.
We had known Charlie since grade school. We grew up with Charlie. He was 3 years older than us.
We had some people that we interviewed that said they fought a lot or she wanted to break up with him.
I didn't think Charlie was good for anyone. In Terry's mind, he was temporary.
A couple of weeks before her homicide, we found out that he borrowed her car while she was at work and failed to pick her up. She walked to the tavern, and then they got in a bit of an argument, and she finally said enough is enough.
Friends worried how Charlie might react to Teresa moving on.
Some of the people indicated that Teresa told them this boyfriend was jealous and said that if he caught her going out with somebody else, he'd kill her.
He said, give me 2 weeks and you won't have your friend anymore. You're like, what do you mean I won't have my friend?
So that it raises a flag that we have to determine if it got worse after that, or was it just a one evening spat.
You know, stabbing is very personal. That usually is indicative that they know each other.
Why did someone do this? What did she do that was so bad that someone had to stab her repeatedly in this crime of passion?
Police immediately bring Charlie in for questioning.
Charlie was very nervous and seemed to act like he didn't really want to be there.
When police ask Charlie where he was the night of the murder, he says he was home.
He lived in the basement of his parents' house, and he was alibied by his mother. I remember the mother claiming there's no way he could get out of this house without me hearing it.
However, he slept in the basement, which the patio door opens up from the basement outside, so he could leave the house without his parents knowing. At times, Teresa got off of work at 11 at night, and she's found in the morning at 5 or 6 o'clock. So his alibi has weaknesses. It's not airtight.
Could Charlie have snuck out, driven to see Teresa, and murdered her?
Did Charlie have access to a car? He borrowed cars from people a lot. So could he have had a car that night? Yeah, he could have. The homicide's probably less than 5 miles from his house.
Police look to the tire track evidence.
The tire tracks at the scene were measured and documented. I made contact with the Michigan State Police, who have a database of vehicles. They came back with a list of vehicles based on manufacturer specifications that could have created that. And it's quite a large list.
While detectives continue to investigate Charlie, they also turn to the box factory where Teresa worked.
Whenever you have a homicide like this and it's right down the road from where she worked, obviously your biggest pool of suspects has to be the guys she worked with. There was a fair number of men that were interested in her, and there were some that, had dated her. There were some that wanted to date her.
It wasn't like she was going out and dating them. She just liked hanging out with them.
So we went to the factory to determine who had contact with Teresa, and is there anything that stands out and points to any particular individual as possibly having done this.
We interviewed one of her co-workers named Mark Lebecki. Mark Lebecki worked the same shift as Teresa.
Mark was known as a soft-spoken but well-liked guy at the factory.
He's a very quiet individual, very reserved. Most people would describe him as very mellow.
Working just a few machines away from each other, Mark and Teresa had become close.
He talked to her at work. He was a nice, likable person.
And it got to the point where they developed kind of a friendship.
Unlike the men at the factory who wanted to date Teresa, Mark preferred sharing stories about his family.
Mark Lebecki told Teresa that he had a couple kids and he kept photos of them in his wallet. He would show them to Teresa, saying, "These are my kids."
He talked to her enough to create a relationship that she felt the need to go and talk to him when he needed a friend.
Mark tells police he is saddened by Teresa's death. He also remembers something was off with her the night she died.
He indicated that he saw her that night of the homicide and commented that it looked like she was having a bad day, and she said, yeah, something was jamming in her machine.
She just laughed it off and moved on.
Having no reason to question Mark further, police turned to coworkers with a less amicable relationship with Teresa.
There were some statements from individuals that they observed her having an argument with somebody. by the vehicle before the night of the homicide.
The man Teresa was arguing with is identified as her coworker, Isaac Alvarez. When police dig into his background, they find some troubling details.
Isaac Alvarez was just a little bit weird, and he always carried a knife.
At one point, he was upset with a coworker, and he said, "I'm gonna cut that cracker," or "I'm gonna knife that bitch." He told somebody else that, he can cut people like paper.
His comments about cutting up a supervisor, those are the comments that we heard, and those are the comments that kept our interest in him.
To find out more, police look into Isaac's personal life.
His ex-wife indicated that he did have a knife he always kept on his belt, and she indicated that he could become abusive and violent after one drink.
Police bring in Isaac to shed light on his relationship with Teresa and why they were arguing at work.
And in talking to him about Teresa, you could see the emotion coming out of him. This was very stressful for him. That's also the type of stressor that might cause somebody to commit a homicide.
Then, Isaac reveals something else.
He did ask Teresa if she wanted to meet him for a drink, and Teresa, being who Teresa was, she didn't say, "No way." She said, "Well, we'll see." He shows up and she's not there. Is that rejection?
Had Teresa's rejection sent Isaac into a murderous rage?
We asked Isaac to take a polygraph. Because of Isaac's strange behaviors, outbursts, maybe prone to violence, and always carrying a knife, and he was seen in the parking lot area that night, he was on our main suspect list.
While investigating the stabbing death of Teresa Wesolowski, police focus on her coworkers.
She's working in a factory populated by mostly men. That sets up a scenario where you're going to have people trying to ask her out. She was outgoing and she was friendly, so people could perceive that as being led on, where in fact she was probably just being nice.
She always tried to let him down easy. She would always be like, "Well, I don't want to hurt his feelings." She just wanted to make sure that they still wanted to be her friend.
At the police station, investigators interview one of those workers, Isaac Alvarez. Witnesses saw Isaac argue with Teresa before the night of her death.
Isaac's alibi, when he was interviewed, he was home. He lives with a 50-plus-year-old lady. His story was he went to bed at 9 o'clock, and he may have had a conversation with her when she came home, but he doesn't recall. She says she had a conversation with him 11:15, 11:30 at night, and she thought it was around 1 o'clock when he went to bed. It's a little different than his story. Well, in his case, is that person willing to lie for you? We don't know. So that's not an airtight alibi.
Police convince Isaac to take a polygraph.
He was somewhat deceptive and not answering the questions in the proper manner, and so we believe that he was trying to skew the results of the polygraph.
You couldn't get a good answer from him.
So because of that, it was ruled inconclusive.
Without any hard evidence, police can't charge Isaac for the crime. While detectives look for more leads, Teresa's autopsy report arrives.
Based on the injury patterns, the attack was a surprise attack because we did not see a significant amount of defensive type injuries. And then she was pinned in a prone or face down position. I individually identified and labeled 47 separate stab wounds. This would have been a horrifying death for any individual.
As police review evidence, they follow up on the lead on the bloody man from the Department of Public Works.
They had a sketch made of this unknown person that stopped at the garage to wash up.
We put it out there. The individual didn't come forward. It was out in the press. It was in the newspaper. I did go back and re-interview the witnesses, but nothing came back of evidentiary value.
Police also continue interviewing Teresa's friends.
I always protected Terry. So when she was killed, I had no purpose anymore. And so I gave my all to whatever they needed. It was hours and hours and hours of interviews with the police, trying to give them everything that I knew about every person we had ever hung out with, for me to help them to hopefully find who did this.
One of the people detectives learn about is Jerry Kirkpatrick.
So Jerry Kirkpatrick was a delivery guy to Cousins where Teresa worked.
Friends say Jerry asked Teresa out numerous times.
I don't think she was looking to have a relationship with him. He was definitely interested in her.
That's the indication that we got, that he was pursuing her more than she was pursuing him.
Police learn about one encounter with Jerry that left Teresa unsettled.
I thought I saw Jerry before she died at the club, just watching us. And it gave me this feeling like, why is he here? Like, he shouldn't know we're here. Why is he standing off in the shadows? It was a very creepy feeling.
So the question is Jerry stalking her?
But then, Teresa's friends point out something else disturbing about Jerry.
They thought he might be similar to the picture of the person that was at the Department of Public Works. The drawing looked like him.
Officers immediately interview Jerry at his home. Jerry denies he is the man in the sketch. He claims he was at a bar with his stepbrother the night of Teresa's murder, then went home before midnight.
There was alibi information that was confirming of the statement. When he got home, he called for a pizza to be delivered, and that was confirmed subsequently with phone records. He let us look at his vehicle. We examined the interior or exterior. Nothing of evidentiary value was located in that examination.
Then, investigators make a startling discovery.
There were knives found at Jerry Kirkpatrick's residence.
A lot of times we'd ask people, do you have knives? And can we see those knives? Do you mind if we have them tested? A lot of times that's done for a reaction. So he presents 4 or 5 knives. He did let us look at them when we were at the house. We even submitted them to the crime lab to have it analyzed.
While investigators wait for results, Jerry's landlord delivers some alarming news.
What happens within the next few days is he talks to his landlord about breaking his lease.
Jerry Kirkpatrick decided to move out of town, and that's in the midst of being interviewed and the investigation. So right away, that raises our suspicion.
Was Jerry trying to give detectives the slip?
It is clearly a red flag, and we have to look at that behavior as being possibly flight behavior. So we want to find out why.
While investigating Jerry Kirkpatrick for the brutal stabbing of 22-year-old Teresa Wesolowski, detectives learn from Jerry's landlord he's about to skip town.
The landlord knew the police were talking to Jerry. We were actually notified by the Milwaukee Police Department because the landlord had thought, hey, this is odd, and called them. He says he's going to move to Tennessee. One of the aspects you look at in a homicide, is there any flight behavior after the homicide? Well, breaking your lease and moving to Tennessee might be described as flight behavior. We did confirm that he put money on a place on that Friday after the homicide.
But when investigators get the lab results back on Jerry's knives, the case takes a frustrating turn.
Nothing came back of evidentiary value.
Somebody having a collection of knives is not that uncommon, especially in Wisconsin. And the quick move that he made is something strange, but, there's nothing we can do about it. If he wants to move, he can move.
Police have one more lead to follow: Jerry's resemblance to the bloody man at the Public Works building.
He fit that description. We actually did an in-person lineup with Jerry, and he was not picked out by the individuals that observed this person driving the truck.
That person was never identified and never located.
Without any hard evidence linking Jerry to the murder, Police have to let him go. Weeks go by, and investigators worry the case will grow cold.
We're doing interviews. Some people we're re-interviewing. But as time moves on, the investigation is getting older and older and harder to solve.
As the weeks turn into months, investigators doggedly work the case.
Well, I technically could have retired about 5 years before I did. A lot of it is to bring justice for the victim, but also to bring some sort of resolution or closure for the family.
The police kept telling me that it was someone close to her because of the horrific nature of it. I alienated myself from people because I just didn't know who I could or couldn't trust.
Months turn into years, but Teresa's loved ones make sure she's not forgotten.
Once a year on the date of the murder, the families would come out and hold vigils. It was a way for the family to try to say that we're still fighting to resolve this case.
But we use it as a way of seeing who is showing up and maybe more importantly, who isn't showing up.
Nothing seems out of the ordinary until 2005, 6 years after the murder, when Teresa's family notices something unusual.
Her mom had called me and said, "Did you happen to go out and leave flowers for Terry?" And I said, "No, I didn't."
These arrangements showed up, and they checked around and didn't know who put them there. So that always leads you to believe, is there somebody out there that's feeling guilty about committing a homicide and leaving something on a gravesite?
We had a camera installed to see if maybe we could identify the next time somebody did something like that. But we didn't capture any image or anything.
For detectives, it's another dead end. But then, with the investigation on the brink of going cold, a new forensic technology turns this 6-year-old case red hot.
In 2005, I got a contact from the Wisconsin Crime Lab, and Patty said, "Hey, I want you to submit this list of items for us to analyze using a technique called YSTR DNA testing."
With YSTR DNA testing, it allows us to find a very small amount of Y chromosome male DNA and a very large amount of DNA from a female source. So it's like finding that single grain of salt in a large bag of sugar.
Early on, when we had the blood evidence on Teresa's hands tested, it all came back as her DNA. That's a problem because it's not giving us a lead. What happens if we strip away all the X chromosomes? If she's a female and that's all her blood, there should be nothing left.
The analyst retests the swabs of Teresa's hands for male DNA.
The first thing I did was look at the previously run DNA samples to see if there was any Y chromosome DNA present in those. All of a sudden, all the DNA types I developed on her hands are matching a known standard for male DNA, and it was incredible. I contacted Detective Yogers for samples of DNA from individuals known to be connected to the case.
And now we're going to go take DNA samples from all of our suspects. We took what was probably our 25 top suspects, nearest and dearest, ex-boyfriend, boyfriend, that type of thing. That first group was a 0.
Undeterred, investigators submit more samples.
We went back to the list and got a second group.
We were testing people that were ancillary people. We had DNA from officers at the crime scene that we used to eliminate.
I didn't think we were going to get an answer for this case.
Then, after over 40 samples, a breakthrough.
The testing came back and only one person matched the Y chromosome found mixed into the blood on Teresa's hand.
Detective Yogers called me and said, "You're not going to believe this. The last guy that I swabbed is the guy that has a positive match on that DNA."
After 7 years investigating the murder of Teresa Wesolowski, detectives have now matched DNA from the scene to one of their suspects.
I was beyond excited. I actually shouted, "Oh my God," at my desk. We had a match from the DNA on Teresa's hands to Mark Lebecki.
Right away, I'm like, who's that guy?
Mark Lebecki is a co-worker of Teresa's. Mark Lebecki was one of the individuals that was interviewed by the officers. His statement was that he and Teresa were friendly at the factory.
So the murder occurs, and Mark Lebecki kept working there and was still working there.
Before they approach Mark, detectives need more than just the DNA evidence.
Now, the other heavy lifting starts because even the DNA evidence isn't going to stand on its own. So we need to bring all these other factors into play in building a case that's sufficient for the DA to charge.
First, detectives go back to the factory to dig deeper into Mark's background.
Some people said, "Oh, no, Mark Lebecki, he wouldn't kill anybody. He's just a puppy." He would show people pictures of little girls, and he said they were his daughters. "What do you think I should get them for Christmas or birthday, whatever?"
When detectives look closer, they discover Mark isn't all he claims to be.
Well, he was never married. He didn't have any kids. So this is just like weird. He had this like pretend life.
Mark Lebecki was pretty much a loner, lived with his parents in a mobile home in a rural area, apparently liked to watch television, play video games.
I think it was just a big fantasy with him, a big game to try to fit in.
What else had Mark been hiding?
We had one person that said that Mark had asked her what she thought he could do to better his chances with going out with Teresa. So he clearly had a focus on her.
Detectives revisit evidence from the crime scene, starting with the bloody boot prints.
The problem with identifying somebody with a common shoe is there's so many of them. There could be millions of those shoes made. I contact a person in Scottsdale, Arizona, the detective in their forensic unit, and he had the foremost outsold databases that existed. And he said, that is a Texas steer outsole. Early in the investigation, we had information about the employees being supplied shoes or they could purchase shoes from the store.
When police search factory records, they make a crucial discovery.
And we determined that Mark Lebecki had submitted a receipt for a Texas steer shoe.
Next, investigators turn to the tire tracks left at the scene.
So we took 56 people out of our investigation and identified the vehicles that were registered to them at the time of the homicide. 5 individuals had vehicles that were able to make that mark at the scene. One of them was Mark Lebecki.
With the evidence piling up, detectives ask Mark to come down to the police department for an interview.
He was quiet. He answered the questions. He was confident, I would say.
That confidence doesn't last long.
When he finds out that his DNA is on her hands, he then starts to try and explain why they are there. What started out as I just talked to her at the door is I didn't talk to her then, I talked to her at a break, and we may have hugged.
Detectives confront Mark with the evidence.
I told him the car, wheel track matches. Your DNA is found on her hands, and a boot that you wear is in the blood footwear impression on the road. So, we're looking at you. You need to start explaining some of this stuff.
Now, it's Mark's turn to drop a bombshell on police.
He said, I don't want to get anyone else in trouble. I don't want to be a snitch. Then he mentioned this guy named Tom Thompson.
Tom Thompson worked at the factory with Mark and Teresa.
At the time of the homicide, the officers that went up and did the canvass at the factory did speak with Tom Thompson. His statement to them was that he knew Teresa. He wasn't necessarily friends with Teresa. They never dated, anything like that.
Mark tells them what happened the night of the murder.
Mark said he stopped on the side of the road to buy some cocaine from Thompson.
He said that when he got up there was a vehicle already parked in front where he parked. and Tom Thompson walked up to his vehicle.
So Thompson goes in, sits in the back seat. Mark said, I am doing the cocaine in the front of the seat.
According to him, Teresa gets in the back seat and gets in an argument with Tom, and he proceeds to stab her. Mark says he only hears thumping and movement in the back seat.
Now it's time to start poking holes in this story. She cannot be stabbed 40-some times in the back seat of someone's car and they not know what's going on. The whole interior would have been covered in blood. So that's out right there.
Mark says Teresa flops out of there onto the ground. Tom Thompson continues to stab her and drags her to that location alongside the vehicle.
According to Mark, Thompson then turned on him.
Tom Thompson tell him, you keep your mouth shut, and then he let him go. So he kept his mouth shut. He didn't go to the police.
4 years later, Tom Thompson dies, but Mark keeps silent for another 3 years.
He's trying to explain how he's involved in this homicide, and the easiest thing to do is to blame it on the dead guy.
Detectives re-interview workers at the factory about Tom Thompson.
Everybody to a person said he was a health nut.
We have found no indication that he was dealing cocaine or using cocaine.
Investigators asked Teresa's friends if she used drugs.
Terry wanted nothing to do with cocaine. Nothing.
So she wouldn't have gone there to buy drugs from Tom Thompson. What was her reason for being there?
There's one last piece of evidence to examine. The car that Mark drove at the time of the murder.
We wanted that vehicle. We found it by another owner, and we ended up buying it from that guy. We brought it down to the lab and examined it for blood, hair, whatever evidence that we could. That rear seat was taken apart. It was a perforated leather, so there were holes in it. So the blood went down through the holes in that leather, and then they soaked into the foam rubber of that seat.
Does the blood belong to Teresa? It's sent to the lab for analysis.
I was very excited to call Mike Yogers and let him know I had found a possible match.
Ten years after 22-year-old Teresa Wesolowski is stabbed to death, detectives are waiting to see if blood found in the back of coworker Mark Lebecki's car belongs to her.
Those DNA profiles matched the DNA profile from Teresa Wesolowski.
Oh, it was significant. It was an important moment.
But what about Mark's claim that coworker Tom Thompson killed Teresa?
At this stage, and 7 years after the murder, Lebecki is implicating a man who had died 3 years earlier, but it was only Lebecki's DNA that was ever found on Teresa's body. They find blood in a cushion of a seat in Lebecki's car. They find that that's Teresa's DNA. They have his DNA, her DNA, and at that point, the case was made.
That was the final thing that district attorney needed to issue the charge. We really felt that we had turned the corner on this case.
Detective Yogers called me and he said, I just want to let you know that we are going to make an arrest. And I was so excited. I was waiting, just waiting for the news.
Detectives go to the box factory where Mark works.
We watched for him to come out of the building, and Kim and I walked up to him and told him he was under arrest. I was excited. It was a good day.
Mark denies killing Teresa, so investigators are left to piece together what really happened that night.
I think Mark Lebicki was a very lonely person that probably imagined a relationship with Teresa and decided she was the one. She was just being nice to people. And he probably read that for more than it was.
I think for Terry, it was more that this guy was telling him his problems at work, and she was a listener. She would listen. He wore on her heartstrings and her niceness as a person.
Then, on May 28th, 1999, Mark made his move.
I think that she was coming out of the building, and Mark for whatever reason, convinced her to meet him. They meet at the back of the vehicle.
I think that he probably did ask her to come back to his place for the night. And when she said no, he just went on a rampage and just started stabbing her. He stabbed her multiple times on that road. Then he dragged her over to that grass. He stabbed her some more. There's blood flying up on her car. He was a monster that night.
We can only guess at it because he's not talking. We don't have to prove why he did this. We just have to prove that he did.
After the vicious stabbing, Mark returned to his normal routine.
Mark Lebecki continues to work at the factory. He doesn't make any erratic move like moving away or changing jobs. He just sort of carries on with life as he did before the murder. He had no criminal record. Mark Lebecki certainly did not emerge as a likely suspect at all. It was shocking to hear that Mark Lebecki had killed Teresa.
It was almost surreal. It got me because it wasn't anyone I knew.
At trial, Mark Lebecki enters a plea of not guilty and sticks to his story that Tom Thompson killed Teresa.
Clearly, his incentive was to try and show somebody else did it back there. But that doesn't hold up.
I don't think the jury bought that at all.
Mark is convicted of first-degree murder, and in November 2010, he is sentenced to 30 years in prison with no chance of parole.
Mark Lebecki did not admit guilt. The judge noted that Lebecki never expressed any remorse.
In his mind, he's still not guilty. And the judge even said to him, I hope that someday you will admit to yourself that you've done this, because you have done this.
The journey was long and tedious. It will never replace Teresa for the family. She was a good kid. She was moving forward with her life. She probably would have maybe had grandkids. All those things are lost because of Mark.
I have pictures up of us. We had always said we would grow old together and raise our children together. My kids always ask, Mom, why was your friend murdered? I don't know. Is she in heaven? Yeah, I think she is.
A woman enjoying retirement after a lifetime of hard work.
My mother did very well for herself. She was a very strong-willed woman.
Nina was quirky. I can't tell you how much she loved frogs and Elvis Presley and country music. She just marched to her own drum and did her thing.
Found brutally murdered in her home.
He stabbed her 24 times.
There was blood throughout the house.
It's like living in a bad horror movie.
A dangerous predator eludes police.
She had been sexually assaulted. Our victim potentially knew who the suspect was.
I kept asking them, is this going to be a cold case? And they kept telling me, we're not done yet.
DNA evidence leads to a shocking realization.
It was a match to another murder.
The thought that we had a serial killer here in town scared the hell out of me.
And a suspect no one saw coming.
To call this an unexpected killer is an understatement.
That's like every person's nightmare.
It hit me like a ton of bricks.
Kansas City is a large metropolitan area on the border between Kansas and Missouri.
Kansas City can be a very fun place to be. We love our sports in this city. It's a very friendly place to live.
Nothing seems out of the ordinary on October 29th, 2010, until Kansas City police receive a 911 call about a woman found unresponsive in her home.
A woman called police and said she discovered her mother at the bottom of the basement stairs, and she checked her for vital signs and found she was dead.
When the first officer arrives on the scene, the caller leads them to her 75-year-old mother, Nina Whitney.
I showed them my mother's body laying at the bottom of the stairs. I told the police officers I believe she had just dropped over from a heart attack. And then I called my cousin Kim.
The phone rang and I picked it up, and Paige told me my mother is dead. Paige said she thought maybe Aunt Nina fell down the stairs going to the garage.
While Paige speaks with her cousin on the phone, police take a closer look at Nina's body.
Nina was face down, and there was a shelving unit there with a bunch of glass frogs, and a lot of those frogs had fallen off the shelf on top of her. It initially looks like an accident and a natural death, but when they rolled the victim over, they discovered several stab wounds in her chest. And also, what were determined were defensive wounds on her hands, which is something that we see when someone fights back.
Clearly, this is no accident, and detectives arrive to begin a homicide investigation.
When someone's stabbed like the victim was, it usually means there's some sort of emotion tied there because you're actually stabbing someone instead of just shooting them or something like that. Her blouse had been pulled up, and there were buttons missing. And they quickly discovered that there what they believed to be saliva on her breast, which they swabbed. So it felt like this was sort of a sexual in nature homicide.
Police inform Paige that her mother has been murdered.
I don't think I've ever been that stunned in my entire life. It's just, it's so surreal. It's like living in a bad horror movie. I don't know how to describe it. You're just totally and completely stunned.
A lifelong native of the Midwest, Nina Whitney was a woman with humble roots.
My mother was born in South Dakota, and then their family wound up here in Kansas City in the late 40s, early 50s. My mother had a very rough life. My mom's mom left their family, so my mom was left to take care of her younger siblings. She married my father, and my parents divorced when I was about 9 years old. My father left her pretty much destitute. So it was just the two of us, and we struggled tremendously. My mother worked some very hard jobs, and we lived on food stamps.
Eventually, Nina found a stable, well-paying career.
She worked on the assembly line at General Motors here in Kansas City. She managed to buy a house, and she did very well for herself. She was a very strong-willed woman.
Nina wanted a better life for her daughter and encouraged Paige to get an education.
I went into criminal justice at Central Missouri State University, and I was probation parole officer for 25 years. The older I became, the closer my mother and I became. We spent a tremendous amount of time together. My mother started collecting frogs back in the mid-70s. Ceramic, glass, dishes, clothes, bedding, towels. The entire house was filled, wall to wall, floor to ceiling, with frogs.
Nina's favorite hobby earned her the nickname, the Frog Lady.
Nina was quirky. I can't tell you how much she loved frogs and Elvis Presley and country music. She just marched to her own drum and did her thing.
Investigators are stunned that someone would viciously attack this 75-year-old woman in her home.
I was in total shock, truly. She was in her house, minding her own business, not doing anything wrong. Like, how on earth did that happen?
When I found out Nina had been killed, I couldn't imagine who could have done this. I had no ideas.
Detectives interview Paige to narrow down when the murder might have taken place.
Friday, at about 6:45, I decided to call my mother to see what time she wanted to go shopping on Saturday. And that's when she didn't answer the phone. It was extremely unusual for her not to answer the phone. So then I called the cell phone, and she didn't answer that either. Then I started to panic. So then I took off and went out south toward her house. And when I got to her house, the porch light was not on, and I knew something was very wrong. So I walked through to the kitchen, and it was dark. So I turned the light on, and there was her body laying at the bottom of the stairs. And I could feel the back of her head, and her head was ice cold. And I called 911, And then it just kind of hit me out of the blue that I was hearing weird noises. So I followed the noise upstairs to the hall bathroom. Both faucets in the tub were running full blast. And I thought, well, that's just really strange because my mother didn't use that bathroom.
Detectives wonder if Nina's killer had turned on the faucets, and if so, why?
The victim's daughter had located the guest bathroom bathtub faucets running, and she had turned those faucets off. So the bathroom was processed for fingerprints and DNA.
In the victim's bedroom, there was like an imprint of where it looked like somebody had been laying on the comforter.
And near the bed, we could see buttons that appeared to be similar to the victim's blouse, as well as a hair roller that was similar to the hair rollers in the victim's hair. So that led us to believe that the victim was assaulted and maybe her blouse may have been torn open at that location.
As every corner of the house is searched for evidence, investigators make a crucial discovery.
We opened up the knife drawer in the kitchen and located a paring knife where the blade was bent and there was blood at the base of the blade near the handle. That could mean that somebody had tried to wipe it clean.
Forensics bagged the knife for further analysis and processed the house with luminol, which can indicate the presence of blood.
The luminol tells us that somebody was moving around in that house with some amount of blood on them. We got that blue glow in the victim's bedroom, bathroom, hallway, living room, and the kitchen.
The front door was unlocked, and we didn't find any sign of forced entry, which was a big clue for us that our victim potentially knew who the suspect was.
There's no reason for anyone to hurt her. And my mother was not a very social person at all. She had no family other than me here in town that would be in and out of the house.
Paige points to one detail detectives could not have determined from their search.
There was a shelf by the front door where her cell phone always was, so she could take it when she went out the front door, and it was missing.
Had the killer snatched Nina's cell phone? Police request a trace on it, while officers go door to door looking for witnesses.
One of my other detectives found a party down the street that had seen a white male in the neighborhood earlier that day. He was in his 50s, walking with a limp. The witness saw him go to a black Jeep. He saw that car was parked kind of behind the house, about a block away. And so he sees this guy walking and kind of looking around. And so he just kind of mentally noted it. He kind of looked like he was probably up to no good.
Could the suspicious man be Nina Whitney's killer? As they start to track him down, detectives catch a break.
We found that Nina's phone was still on and still being used in South Kansas City. We were able to do surveillance and observe the person using our victim's cell phone.
Coming up, a break in the case reveals a potential serial killer.
We had another homicide.
There were zip ties that have been used for bindings.
He terrorized an entire community.
And a grieving daughter takes matters into her own hands.
I did feel a need to help them investigate my mother's homicide.
If she didn't get the answers, then she kept asking.
In my gut, I just knew that was him.
Detectives investigating the vicious stabbing of 75-year-old Nina Whitney believe the killer stole her cell phone. Now, police have traced the phone to an address in South Kansas City and rush to apprehend the suspect.
We did kick his door in, and when we took the suspect into custody, we found that he had the phone on his person.
The suspect goes by the nickname Lil Mickey. Police demand to know how he came into possession of a murdered woman's cell phone.
He told us he was walking down the street pretty close to our victim's house and found that phone laying in the grass. He said he didn't make the most money in the world and was just glad to have a cell phone that was working and started using the cell phone.
Skeptical of his story, investigators ask him if he killed Nina Whitney.
Little Mickey adamantly denied being involved in any sort of violence with our victim or anything where someone was harmed or killed. We asked him, could you have bought this phone off somebody else? Did you get it from a person?
Despite hours of questioning, Lil Mickey stands by his story.
His story was, I found the phone there in the grass and picked it up.
Police want to know his whereabouts at the time of the murder.
Based on her lights being off in the house, we believe Nina's murder happened during daylight hours. And he did provide an alibi, a female that he had been with that day.
Investigators have no grounds to detain Lil Mickey any longer, but they obtain a sample of his DNA just in case.
He wouldn't seem like he would have a motive to commit this type of crime, but we still had to do our due diligence.
The next day, police tracked down the woman he used as his alibi.
So we talked to her. The information she was able to provide, it matched up with what he had been saying.
With Lil Mickey looking unlikely as the killer, detectives turned back to the theory that Nina knew her attacker.
It was obvious that she had let someone in the house because there was absolutely no forced entry.
We had to look at Nina's history and try to figure out who she would have let into the house. And we also had the witness that had seen a white male in the neighborhood. My supervisor thought that a composite sketch would be a good thing to pursue in this case. The witness willingly came down to police headquarters and met with our sketch artist. She sat with him and gave a pretty good-looking composite sketch of what he believed the party looked like that he saw that day. We showed Paige that picture, and she looked at it for a long time, but didn't necessarily jog her memory about who it could possibly be.
The individual did not look familiar to me at all. I could not for the life of me think of anyone who fit that description.
Investigators can't be certain if the man seen by Nina's neighbor is the killer. But with few quality leads, police decide to release the sketch to the media.
I was the publisher and editor of the Cass County Democrat-Missourian. We all know that police sketches are an inexact science. However, I think they can be very useful. So we had run the sketch in the newspaper to put that sketch out to a larger audience.
As the sketch goes public, detectives work with Paige to come up with a list of people that Nina would have had a reason to let into her home.
She'd had quite a bit of work done on the house in the last year or so there had been lots of people in and out working on the house.
Maybe someone that is a predator did work inside her house and decided that she would be a good victim. Paige went back into Nina's home and went through all of her records to show us dates and times when she had stuff done at her house.
The detectives got all that information from me and questioned everyone who had been in and out of that house.
My squad started working to collect DNA from anyone that we thought had contact with Nina, and I think we collected about 40 to 50 samples. Honestly, most people were willing to provide their DNA to us when we explained that this was an elderly woman that was brutally murdered. If there was someone that maybe we thought was fishy or involved or could potentially be the suspect, DNA is good to rule people out in cases like this.
The forensics lab will compare the scores of samples to the DNA recovered from Nina's body.
It'd be nice as a detective to get DNA results like they do on TV, 5 seconds later. But it was about a month after the homicide when we got our results back. My boss called me and she said that we had a DNA hit. So I thought that, well, if there's a DNA hit, then we'll be able to find a suspect. But that wasn't the case because it was unknown DNA.
The DNA does not match the dozens of samples collected by homicide investigators.
Everything from the mailman to Little Mickey to contractors that had been inside her house. It rules them out, absolutely. But the DNA profile that was found was a match to another murder almost 2 years to the day in Harrisonville, Missouri. So we knew at that point that this was not the first time that this suspect did this. And that wasn't something I expected. It was a big deal. What concerned us was that we did have a serial killer type situation.
after the murder of Nina Whitney. DNA taken from the crime scene as matched to another homicide in the national database.
It was a match to another unsolved murder in Harrisonville, Missouri. It's a smaller town about an hour south of Kansas City. Kara Jo Roberts was found inside her home in the bathtub, shot in the head with the bathtub running, just like Nina. It seemed like a sexually motivated homicide, and with the tub running, that matches Nina at our scene.
Police decide to keep this explosive new information under wraps.
At that point, we were trying to keep this information close to the chest because the suspect didn't know that we knew both crime scenes were connected. We did not want that in the public.
Detectives even withhold this new development from the victims' loved ones, including Paige.
I kept asking them, when is this going to be a cold case? And they kept telling me, well, not yet. We're not done yet. And I don't know what they were doing, but I know they were doing things behind the scenes.
Investigators head to Harrisonville to get briefed on the Kara Jo Roberts case.
Just reading through a case file doesn't give you the whole story. So to talk to an investigator that actually worked that case, it helps paint a better picture of what happened in the other investigation.
I was one of the detectives from Kansas City at the time that was sent to work on this case. Kara Jo and her husband lived right there in the small town. They had a kid. Seemed like a very happy relationship. Just your normal, happy family.
The Roberts family was devastated by a horrific tragedy on November 5th, 2008.
Her husband found Kara in the bathroom. She wasn't wearing any clothes. There were obvious gunshot injuries. She was in the bathtub, and the bathtub was running. There were zip ties that we speculated at the time had been used for bindings.
At the Kara Jo Roberts scene, we found 2 different white-colored zip ties that appear to have been used but cut. We also found a roll of duct tape. On both the zip ties and the duct tape, we had male DNA.
There was DNA found on Kara's body, and there was indications given by the medical examiner that she had been sexually assaulted.
Detectives investigating Nina's murder ask for a rundown of the suspects in Kara Jo's case.
Based on the fact of no forced entry, very much kind of angled towards us believing that the husband may have had something to do with this. A domestic violence type homicide is usually spur of the moment, rage and kind of action, but this could have been a situation where he was trying to control her physically with the bindings, and then it escalated.
Kara Jo's husband claimed he found his wife dead when he got home from work and immediately called 911.
From the time she was last seen to the time when her husband came home and found her was a very tight window. It was only like 45 minutes. Her husband gave what was kind of a complex alibi, but when we went to talk to his friends who were involved in that alibi, they were able to corroborate everything.
DNA testing at the time also cleared Kara Jo's husband, and no other viable suspects were identified. The investigation went cold until the DNA connection to Nina Whitney's murder revives the case 2 years later.
Nina's homicide was a lifeline to the Kara Jo Roberts case. We have double information, and we have a bigger picture of what's going on in both of these acts.
What we have to do at that point is start doing what's called victimology. You basically have to understand the circle of Kara Jo's world, and you look at the circle of Nina's world. You know these 2 cases are linked, and you want to find those commonalities in between.
What was really interesting was all the stuff in the Kara Jo Roberts case that matched up to Nina's case. As far as the tub running, we had a lot of different theories, but our main one was if our suspect was going to commit a rape, they would want to use that tub to wash away evidence after the act. In Nina's case, he turns on the water to try to maybe get her body up into the bathtub. He may have not been able to drag her body up those stairs. Our witness down the street sees this guy walking with a limp, and we thought the limp may have hindered him from getting her body back up to the tub. So just like our case, the Kara Jo Roberts case had someone down the street that saw someone in the neighborhood.
The witness had seen a Jeep, had seen a male going to the Jeep, and that male may have been limping.
And it looked like they were up to no good.
Despite the telling parallels, police can't find anyone connected to both Nina and Kara Jo.
That was not the answer that we wanted as detectives, because that meant that it was somebody totally random. A random person coming in and taking their life. That's like every person's nightmare.
A case like this, where you know there's a suspect out there that could do this again, it makes it even more urgent to try to catch the person. So you're grasping at straws, looking for any leads, any information, any help you can get to try to solve a case like this.
You can only work with what information you've got coming in, and there wasn't any new information coming in at that point.
Running out of options, detectives turn to the one person who might be able to connect the two victims.
Detective Blank called me, and he said, "Paige, I have something to tell you." And what he told me was more horrifying than my mother's homicide. That scared the hell out of me.
Detectives investigating the stabbing death of Nina Whitney have informed her daughter Paige about a stunning development.
Detective Blank told me that there was a DNA match from the saliva they found on my mother's shirt to DNA that they found on Kara Roberts in Harrisonville. Kara had been raped, put in the bathtub, and then shot in the back of the head. The thought that we had a serial killer here in town is enough to cause panic for every female in this city.
We provided information from both crime scenes to Paige. And that's not something we would normally tell our victim's daughter. But in this case, Paige was a probation and parole officer. She is savvy in law enforcement, so we thought we could trust her with that information. We wanted to see if anything in her memory would be jogged to try to figure out if there's any common people, common locations that both victims would have known or gone to.
At the time, I thought it had to be someone who targeted my mother specifically. But when they showed me the evidence in Kara's case, there's just a million things to think about when you're trying to come up with a profile for someone like that.
There wasn't much there that seemed to be connected between the two victims. There wasn't an aha moment in that meeting at all.
It's been 5 months since the murder of Nina Whitney, and investigators are desperate for a break. They turn back to the composite sketch of the man with the limp seen close to Nina's house.
I wasn't necessarily a believer in the composite sketch thing. People make their own determination on whether they think the information they have is valuable to a case. They see that sketch and they decide, well, this guy's got glasses and the guy I know doesn't have glasses. And so the danger in that is that that person may have information, but that person may be turned off by the sketch.
We had run the sketch in the newspaper, but really that sketch hadn't brought in a lot of leads.
Despite their reservations, police hope that more people will see the sketch on billboards around the city, and someone will identify the suspect.
They were able to put that picture along 71 Highway, along with our tips hotline. The number of tips that we received on this case based on that sketch were not as numerous as you would think. All of them have to be followed up on, because there could be something there that you're going to miss if you don't take those tips seriously.
Weeks pass as investigators chase down leads that go nowhere. The lack of progress takes a heavy toll on Nina's family.
I was really angry that she died in her own home in that terror and that panic, helpless and alone and fighting for her life.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week, I think about my mother's last few minutes of life. I know the neighbor was home next door and nobody heard my mother screaming. I wake up to the sound of her screaming 2, 3 o'clock every morning. It doesn't go away. It does not go away.
There's nothing worse than having to tell a family member, I'm sorry, there's no new information coming in, because they're frustrated. They're of the mindset that, why aren't you out there doing something?
At her wit's end, Paige summons the strength she learned from Nina growing up and takes it upon herself to search for the killer.
The investigation was not moving fast enough to make me happy, so I did feel a need to help them investigate my mother's homicide. I drove around the city and went to every antique shop, every flea market, every thrift store I could think of where she liked to shop.
She was looking for that white male walking with a limp and that black Jeep. And Paige was seeing black Jeeps like that everywhere.
I would take pictures of all the cars that looked like black Jeeps and all the license plates on those vehicles and forwarded all of those to the detectives.
Paige made it her job to be involved, and if she didn't get the answers, then she kept asking.
I can't even explain to you how badly I needed to know who murdered my mother.
Despite Paige's efforts, 6 months after her mother's death, the investigation starts to go cold.
Those kind of unsolved cases in Kansas City leave an entire metro area on edge. As the days turn into weeks and weeks turn into months, how do you keep that case alive within the pages of your newspaper? Most of our weekly papers did not include an update because there was nothing to update in the case.
I kept thinking, this is going to be a cold case. I'm never going to figure it out. I'm never going to figure it out.
You always hope for them to get information to catch a suspect quickly, but I just couldn't fathom who would have done it. I had no suspects in mind.
I drove around and took pictures of the billboards because I wanted to make sure I got pictures of them before they had taken them down. But the sketch concerned me because I don't know if that description was accurate. I thought there's just so many questions that I will never have answers to.
Suddenly, 1 month later, Paige has a realization.
May 26, 2011, I was driving down 71 Highway in rush hour traffic, and I just happened to glance up and look at the lower half of the billboard. And I swear to you, it hit me like a ton of bricks. Like lightning had come out of the sky and hit me in the head. It literally all fell into place as I'm driving down the highway.
Seven months after the murder of Nina Whitney, her daughter Paige has just been struck by a mind-blowing realization.
I was driving down 71 Highway, and I just happened to glance up at the billboard. Prior to that, when they showed me the sketch, the individual did not look familiar to me at all. I just focused on the lower half of his face and the chin, and it just an epiphany. It was Jeff. Jeff Moreland was a boyfriend that I had for 3 years while we were in college. We met in 1983 at Central Missouri State University, had a relationship for 3 years. Jeff and I met in a criminal justice class. He was as sweet and charming and funny as he could possibly be, and I truly fell head over heels in love with him. Once I got my graduate degree, I became a social worker, and Jeff went on to become a police officer. He loved being a police officer. That was his ideal dream job.
Paige and Jeff broke up after 3 years of dating, much to her mother's dismay.
My mother absolutely adored him. For years after we dated, my mother told me she wished I had married him. I know if he showed up on the doorstep, she would happily have let him in the house.
Could Paige's ex-boyfriend from 2 decades prior really be the sadistic serial killer detectives have been hunting for?
I was so lost in my own head, trying to tell myself that Jeff didn't do it. I kept trying to tell myself that I was wrong, but in my gut, I just knew that was him. At the parole office, I'd mentioned it to a couple of the girls that I work with, and they told me that I should run him through the system. So, well, that makes sense. So I ran Jeff through the system. And lo and behold, if he didn't have a black Jeep Wrangler registered in his name, and I nearly lost my cookies. And I also found out Jeff had been a police officer in the Grandview Police Department, but Jeff had retired about 5 years prior to my mother's homicide because he'd had Parkinson's.
Does the Parkinson's diagnosis mean Paige's ex could be the man with a limp spotted near Nina's home? Paige brings her findings to detectives.
I told him that Jeff had been a police officer in Grandview and gave him all the information that I had.
Officers look up Jeff Moreland's home address and discover he lives in the same small town as the first murder victim, Kara Jo Roberts.
He lived in Harrisonville, Missouri. So that was the first person during our investigation that matched all of those factors.
Detective Blank said, yep, it could be him.
Detectives know they have to take extra care when investigating an ex-cop.
Harrisonville is a very small community, and Detective Blank told me that Jeff knew every law enforcement officer in the county, and that he would find out that he was under investigation.
Investigators decide a direct approach is the best option.
We did not believe that we had probable cause at that point to get a search warrant to get his DNA. So we went down and knocked on his front door. I did tell him, your name's come up in a homicide, and we need to get a DNA sample from you. If someone were to tell me that, I'd be like, what homicide are you talking about? That was not Mr. Moreland's reaction. He said, well, I've got to go take my cat to the vet, and he went back inside his house. My gut was telling me that we had our guy, but you need to be sure that this is your guy before you go with your gut.
Police again asked Jeff to provide a voluntary DNA sample.
I ended up calling him and telling him again that, hey, we need your DNA to compare to this homicide, and then we'll be done.
Jeff again claims that he's too busy to provide a sample. A week later, investigators receive an unexpected phone call from the police department Jeff retired from, located just outside Kansas City.
So the sergeant with Grandview Police Department calls us and says that he's been in contact with Jeff Moreland and he provided him a DNA sample. We rushed down there and we made contact with the sergeant. On his desk, he had a pill bottle.
The sergeant provides a strange account of how he obtained Jeff's DNA.
Jeff told him that, I want you to meet me at this gas station along 71 Highway. And Jeff shows up in his black Jeep. And Jeff tells him that Kansas City has come and accused him of being involved in a murder. As he's explaining the story, he takes swabs and puts them in his mouth, and then Jeff hands him this bottle along with my card and says, here, give this to the detectives. We tell the sergeant, that sample's not gonna work. You can't just provide your own sample. And the sergeant sort of indicated, well, we'll just get rid of it in the trash then. We told him, no, we'll take that bottle off his hands and take that from him.
The evidentiary value of this stuff is just worthless. But obviously, we recover it and we examine it.
That DNA was tested, and it did not match our homicide.
The fact that that DNA came back as not a match just didn't surprise me at all. Had he followed protocol, that would have exonerated him. And he very easily could have done that, but he chose not to.
We more and more really thought that we might have had our suspect based on his actions at that point. We all know about serial killers. I was worried that the suspect was going to do this act again.
A few days later, detectives get the call they've been dreading.
I received a phone call. There was a rape that occurred in Harrisonville. But the victim was able to get away, and then she was able to contact police. The victim took the officers to where this event occurred the day before. It was Jeff Moreland's residence. So my first question is, where's Moreland at now?
When police go to arrest Jeff, he's nowhere to be found.
Detective Blank told me Jeff may have raped a third victim, and he is now on the run. I didn't know if he would be after me. I didn't know if maybe he had figured out that it was me who initially contacted the police. That was a nightmare.
Former police officer Jeff Moreland is the prime suspect in the murders of Kara Jo Roberts and Nina Whitney. Tragically, a third woman has now been attacked, but Jeff has disappeared, and investigators fear he may strike again.
When I heard that he had taken off, I was worried about Paige.
The detectives told me they truly did not know where he had gone or what he knew. I told Detective Blank he would probably find Jeff in Iowa near his family.
As Paige predicted, a trace on Jeff's cell phone leads police to a motel in Iowa.
He had taken a bunch of over-the-counter sleeping pills. He tried to take his own life and then ended up in a hospital in Des Moines.
Jeff survives the suicide attempt, and he is taken into custody by local police.
We headed up there to Iowa to get Mr. Moreland's DNA. We drove all the way back from Iowa with it. We wanted to be sure he wasn't going to get out of custody or bond out or whatever. And then the next morning, we got the DNA results back. We told Paige that his DNA matched both crime scenes. Jeff is, in fact, involved in the murders of Kara Jo and Nina.
It just blows my mind. And it was beyond all comprehension to me. This was 2010 when he murdered my mother. And Jeff and I split up in 1987. I had no idea what Jeff would become. The last time I actually saw Jeff was in 1994. He told me then that he periodically would patrol up and down my mother's street just to make sure that everything was okay. And at the time I thought, oh, that's so sweet. But now looking back on it, I just don't know.
Jeff Moreland is charged with the murders of Kara Jo Roberts and Nina Whitney and the sexual assault of the third victim. Soon after laying charges, investigators learn about the source of Jeff's phony DNA.
We were contacted by Jeff Moreland's ex-wife, and Jeff Moreland had a daughter with this ex-wife, and that daughter was engaged to someone. And that guy said that Jeff had called him out of the blue, and Jeff told him that he needed a sample of his DNA for a paternity test because someone was accusing Jeff of being the father of a kid. And so he provided a DNA sample and gave it to Jeff Moreland.
Then, Jeff tricked the Grandview police sergeant with some sleight of hand.
So the sergeant provided us a formal statement where he said he wasn't able to see Moreland's hands at all times when Moreland was taking a sample of his DNA.
Jeff's attempted deception backfires, only giving prosecutors more evidence against him.
There's nothing for the defense to attack. There's nothing to be argued because the physical evidence was just overwhelming.
I think it also says a lot that Jeffrey Moreland had 0 witnesses in his defense at the trial.
He got life without parole plus 50 years consecutive on Kara Roberts' homicide. And then he got 10 years for armed criminal action and 20 years for murder second on my mother's case to run concurrent.
With no trial testimony from Jeff, police and the victims' families are left to piece together exactly what happened to Nina Whitney and Kara Jo Roberts.
What we do know is that Jeff Moreland took Kara Jo's life. My personal opinion is he was driving by and saw her in the yard, and he was in that mode where he was hunting and decided that's his target.
After killing Kara Jo, it seems Jeff developed a taste for murder. He struck again 2 years later.
I believe the day that Nina was murdered, Jeff Moreland simply knocked on the door and Nina saw who it was and let him in the house. It's not necessarily uncommon for a predator to go after older women because they feel like they are easier victims.
Of course, my mother would let him in. And then at some point, he had to have started forcing her backwards up the stairs. I think when he got her into her bedroom, that he tried to rip her shirt off of her, forced her onto the bed, but she did fight back. She did run. My mother went running down the stairs. He chased her. He stabbed her 24 times. The kill shot was here through the throat.
At some point, he turns on the water to try to maybe get her body up into the bathtub to wash off his DNA.
But at that point, he knew with his Parkinson's acting up that there was no way he was going to be able to take her body back up 2 flights of stairs and put her in a bathtub. And then he went upstairs to clean the knife off, put the knife in the kitchen drawer, and went out through the sliding glass door.
Investigators believe that before he left, Moreland stole Nina's cell phone to throw police off his trail.
He has the presence of mind to grab that phone and throw that phone in the grass a quarter-mile away from Nina's house. He knows that the investigator is going to be caught up in that phone as sort of a way to lead us away from him.
I did not know for 8 months who murdered my mother. The 8 months that I spent not knowing made me insane.
When you have families that do their investigations, sometimes it's not the best. But Paige being involved was actually good in this case because she was actually the person that found Jeff Moreland.
I can't even explain to you how grateful I am. Between my mother's neighbor and the sketch artist, I would have never figured it out. Never would have figured it out if it hadn't been for the two of them.
To call this an unexpected killer is almost an understatement. Jeff Moreland terrorized an entire community.
Police speculate that Jeff's forced retirement a few years before the murders may have been the catalyst that set him on the path to kill.
I feel that when he developed Parkinson's and he had his power taken away from him as a police officer, the murders were almost like him getting revenge on the world.
I joined this organization called Parents of Murdered Children and Other Survivors of Homicide Victims. And we're all basically going through the same thing. So it does help to have someone who understands the enormity of what has happened.
I think Nina would want to be remembered as a strong, independent woman who fought to the end. And that's how I'll always remember her.
There are frogs in the stores everywhere. You can't go anywhere without seeing cute little frogs somewhere. I think about my mother all the time when I see things that I know that she would appreciate, or when I hear country music. I think about her a lot.
A beloved father and devoted basketball coach.
Jimmy loved kids.
He loved to talk about coaching basketball and God.
Ruthlessly gunned down in his own home.
There were 10 shell casings. Whoever did this wanted to make sure that he was dead.
Leaving a whole community devastated.
I just started screaming. I literally just lost it.
Detectives follow evidence down a twisted trail.
It was what we call a whodunit. All the doors were locked to some fashion.
There was muddy footprints coming into the foyer area.
To uncover a number of suspects.
He immediately lawyered up. He didn't want to talk about anything.
He had just filed for divorce before he was killed.
Was there some sort of romantic thing gone awry?
And unveil a killer no one could have ever imagined.
They had no remorse, no confessions.
You saying that you killed him?
It shocked me very, very much. This could happen to anybody.
Cordova is a peaceful suburb just east of Memphis, Tennessee. Its wide open spaces and strong church communities make it a haven for families.
Cordova is one of those very safe neighborhoods. Kids riding up and down to the bikes. You honk at your neighbor and your neighbor waves.
It's not a place that we're accustomed to seeing violent crimes.
But in the winter of 2013, the town's carefree spirit is disrupted by a troubled call to police.
The initial call came on a Friday morning from the principal at Ridgeway High School.
Jimmy McLean had not reported to work. He was a school teacher and a basketball coach.
Jimmy was always punctual, so when he didn't show up for work, people immediately started worrying about Jimmy.
Our patrol officers go over there and they knocked on the door, nothing. The front door was locked, the back door was locked, the garage door was shut, all the windows were locked, nothing appeared to be opened or broke. And then one officer was able to look in through some glass doors. And then he saw something that looked like a shell casing.
Immediately on alert, officers quickly force entry into the home.
As soon as they made entry, they saw a black male on the floor with a lot of blood around him, dead.
Homicide investigators are on the scene within minutes.
When I first arrived, we see a male victim laying in the den area of the house who appeared to have been shot multiple times.
Whoever did this wanted to make sure that he was dead.
Detectives find a wallet in the victim's pocket. The ID inside confirms this is 49-year-old Jimmy McClain.
The big thing that stood out at that time was the numerous shell casings that were scattered throughout the living portion of the residence.
There were 10 shell casings, and they were all the same caliber, 40 caliber, but they were two different brands. That puts a theory in your head. Was there two shooters, you know, one brand in one gun, one brand in the other? Or was it just one shooter with mixed rounds?
Detectives can find no murder weapon at the scene, but something else grabs their attention.
There was muddy footprints coming into the foyer area, which we knew were not any of our officers' prints.
We were able to lift those prints.
I truly was hoping we could identify the type of shoe and the actual size of the shoe.
There were no signs of fingerprints to the naked eye, so we were able to swab the doorknobs, both interior and exterior on the front door, for the presence of DNA.
An exhaustive search of the house yields no sign of forced entry.
We had no signs of robbery, no signs of burglary. The big thing to me was all the doors were locked to some fashion, meaning someone locked the door on their way out upon leaving the scene. That told me that most likely our suspect had a key to the residence.
So once we realized that somebody had let themselves in, we were like, well, who's got access to these keys? Did Jimmy know the person who did this?
Detectives also attempt to discover the approximate time the murder happened.
We were able to find out there was a shots fired call that came in our dispatch around 8:50 p.m. 2 days before we found the body.
So started making sense real quick, though, that that's probably when this happened.
As police continue their investigation at the scene, Jimmy's sister, Easter, arrives.
To this day, that is the absolute worst day of my life. It's the day I came around the corner and saw yellow tape around my baby brother's house, who I love so dearly. The police asked me, "Ma'am, do you know who lives here?" I said, "My brother is my brother. Where's my brother?"
Officers confirm Easter's worst fears and tell her that her brother has been killed.
I just started screaming, just howling.
Detectives ask Easter and Jimmy's mother, Jamela, to come downtown. Through her tears, Easter tells detectives how young Jimmy grew up to be such a beloved figure.
We grew up in eastern Arkansas. Jimmy is the fourth of 8 kids. He was intelligent, precocious, very athletic.
From a young age, Jimmy McClain had a passion for basketball.
Jimmy walked tall, slender, like a greyhound. It's real tight muscle, flexible, agile.
His nickname was Full Time because he never played half speed. He always played full speed, and that's how he took life.
Jimmy had played basketball with Scottie Pippen. Jimmy considered Scottie Pippen a friend, and I think it was likewise.
After 7 years of professional basketball, Jimmy took up coaching.
Jimmy loved teaching and mentoring. He just was a natural leader with youth.
Jimmy had found his calling, but one part of his life remained unfulfilled.
The thing that he talked to me the most about was his desire to be married.
In the late 1990s, Jimmy met the partner he'd always dreamed of. Her name was Carla.
He was very happy, very excited. He took his relationship very seriously. The next summer, they got married.
Jimmy also became a father to Carla's 2 children from a previous relationship, 16-year-old Tiffany and 11-year-old Dwayne.
He never had children, so he was looking forward to being a father. They all looked up to him as a mentor and as a father, and he spent a lot of time trying to be sure that they were on a good path. He talked to me a lot about the things he was going to do with Dwayne and Tiffany, and he especially wanted to involve Dwayne in summer basketball camps and so forth. He was very serious about being a good husband and a good father.
Together with Carla, Jimmy raised Dwayne and Tiffany as his own. But after 8 years of marriage, cracks started to show in their relationship.
Carla wanted the divorce at first. I do believe that the problems were related to something that occurred early on in their relationship.
Initially, Jimmy had resisted the idea.
I overheard Jimmy telling her that it doesn't make sense for us to be separated. There's nothing wrong, we're not having problems.
But eventually, Carla and Jimmy split up, and after 4 years of separation, Jimmy finally agreed to make it official.
I don't think I really got the full story about exactly what changed his mind and his heart toward her. But he had just filed for divorce a couple of weeks before he was killed.
Detectives are suspicious. Was the timing just a coincidence? Or did Jimmy's looming divorce have something to do with his murder?
We immediately thought we needed to talk to Carla.
Had Jimmy and Carla been in some sort of argument or confrontation?
Coming up, detectives unearth disturbing clues.
There had been a scandal at the high school.
Why are these numbers erased during the same time period as the homicide?
And the truth blindsides everyone.
We had found the needle in the haystack.
They admitted to killing a basketball coach.
Police have just learned that Jimmy McClain filed for divorce 2 weeks before he was killed. And now detectives need to know if animosity between Jimmy and his soon-to-be ex-wife Carla could have been a motive for murder.
We had asked, Carla and Tiffany and Dwayne, her biological children, to come town.
Dwayne and Tiffany wait in the next room while police talk to Carla, starting with her relationship with Jimmy.
She says, look, we were going through a divorce, but it wasn't because he was doing anything bad. She said that we fell out of love.
Carla tells police that when she and Jimmy were married in 2001, Jimmy treated her kids, Dwayne and Tiffany, like they were his own. But as they grew into their late teens, Carla and Jimmy's parenting styles started to clash.
Carla did advise that Jimmy was really hard on her kids. Jimmy was very discipline-oriented, and she always took the side of the kids. In her eyes, they could do nothing wrong. She wasn't going to let Jimmy over-discipline. And some of the issues is what transformed into this growing away from each other.
Detectives ask Carla directly if she stands to gain from Jimmy's death.
She did advise that she had a life insurance policy through her work where Jimmy was on the policy and she would have been the beneficiary.
Was the life insurance payout a motive for Carla to kill Jimmy? Knowing evidence from the crime scene suggests the killer let themselves in. Detectives need to find out if Carla still had access to Jimmy's home.
We actually did ask Carla if she had a key to the house, and she did not have a key that she could remember.
Undeterred, they ask where Carla was on the night of the murder.
She didn't go out and do anything. She said it was raining that night. It was nasty weather. She actually went to her bedroom and read a book. We asked if anybody could verify that. She said, well, my son, Dwayne, because he was at home as well.
To confirm Carla's alibi, police bring in Dwayne and Tiffany, who are waiting in the next room.
When we saw Dwayne, he's a 19-year-old, kid. Dwayne gave a statement advising to us that, when his mom came home, that he just sat and chilled at the house. He didn't have a cell phone, so he would use his mom's. His mom said that she was down in his bedroom. He said he was up in his bedroom, and they didn't see each other the rest of the night.
Dwayne's account lines up with Carla's, but detectives are curious about whether Dwayne had any conflicts with Jimmy.
Tell me about Jimmy. How was y'all's relationship?
It was cool, but we bumped heads a little bit sometimes. He was straight up in the night. He was cool. He fun, loving person.
Dwayne just was like, I can't believe this happened. I don't know who would have done this.
Police turn their attention to his sister Tiffany, and right away sense some tension.
When we interviewed Tiffany, she admitted her and Jimmy butted heads on things, and she actually moved out. She didn't like being parented by him.
Detectives ask where she was at the time of the murder.
Advised she was at home with her boyfriend during the time frame all that Wednesday evening. So at the time we got through interviewing Carla, Tiffany, and Dwayne, there was not anything to lead us to believe that they had any involvement with the death of Jimmy.
To help confirm their alibis, detectives ask for Carla and Tiffany's cell phones.
We were going to use the technology of the cell phone pinging to corroborate where they were the night of the murder.
While they wait for those results, detectives canvass Jimmy's friends and colleagues to find out who else might have had a key to his house.
Early on in the investigation, we had to look at everything. With Jimmy being a high school teacher, with Jimmy being a basketball coach, there was multiple people that could have done this.
We had to start going back to who knew Jimmy. And the first thing we did was work. We spoke with all the teachers liked Jimmy, other coaches liked Jimmy, the principal liked Jimmy.
Detectives can find no one with a key or even a bad word to say about Jimmy.
He was the kindest, gentlest, most compassionate person that I know. But for somebody to snatch your loved one from you out of their own selfish reasons, it really is heartbreaking, and it makes you mad.
3 days into the investigation, detectives receive Jimmy's cell phone back from forensics and discover that he was texting shortly before he was killed.
He was texting with a female subject, and they were back and forth talking about some directions and basically good night. The last text we identified as a subject named Pam Smith.
The name is new to police, but when they compare the time of her last text with the report of gunshots on the night of the murder, they realize they were just minutes apart. With this new lead, Pam Smith becomes detectives' newest suspect. Who is she? And was she involved in Jimmy's murder?
When you read the text messages between her and Jimmy, the lingering question had to be, was there some sort of, romantic thing gone awry?
Detectives have just discovered that Jimmy McClain was texting with a woman named Pam Smith on the night he was murdered.
We were able to determine that Pam was the last person that Jimmy had contacted.
Investigators need to speak to Pam to see if she has any information that points to the killer.
We called just to say, this is the sheriff's office. Do you know Jimmy? And she was like, yeah, that's my boyfriend.
Detectives inform Pam of Jimmy's murder and carefully gauge her response.
She was extremely distraught. She was like, do I need to come down there? What do I need to do? We still had to figure out who she was. Is she married? Is there an affair situation? Is this a boyfriend, girlfriend situation?
Pam tells detectives that she and Jimmy had only been dating for 6 months.
We were able to sort of dig into the relationship between Pam and Jimmy. What seemed like a healthy relationship.
Pamela claims she was 3 hours away in Nashville at the time of the murder, and she's more than happy to turn over her phone so police can verify her statement.
After talking to her, I mean, there was nothing that she gave any kind of suspicion or anything.
Detectives have one more question for Pamela.
We actually did ask Pam if she had a key to the house, and she advised that she did not have a key.
But she says she knows who does.
Pam had overheard a phone call. Jimmy was telling his wife, Carla, that she could come by the house while he was gone to pick up some mail that had come to the house for her. Pam took note that when they left the house, Jimmy didn't leave the mail in the mailbox or on the front door, but he left it inside the house, which told Pam that Carla had a key to the house.
Police believe the killer had a key, but Carla told detectives she didn't have one. The discrepancy raises a red flag.
Is it possible that Carla had a key to the house? How can we prove that she didn't come into the house the night of the murder?
There's only one way to know for sure.
We used the technology of the cell phone pinging to follow her from her work all the way to home.
The cell phone data indicates Carla was home all night, and her daughter Tiffany was too.
Everybody's statements made sense where they were. There was no reason to pursue any other questions with them or Pam at that moment.
Before Carla and Tiffany can be completely ruled out, police must corroborate the calls and texts on their phones with the complete records from the cell companies.
And those can take several days, depending on the circumstance.
A week after the murder, Jimmy's loved ones pay their respects at his funeral.
Jimmy's funeral was held at a local Church of Christ, probably a couple thousand people there. Jimmy touched a lot of people.
Going to Jimmy's funeral was a tough process for myself. So many people loved him.
The mystery of who could have killed Jimmy is on everyone's mind, and grief-stricken loved ones are desperate for answers.
The family was very concerned, but I felt that absolutely the truth would come out.
It was hard waiting and hoping that they get that person before it's too late.
It's very frustrating. After several days, it gets worse. It gets harder to solve, and the family starts to lose hope in you.
The day after the funeral, detectives received the forensics reports.
There was no extra DNA under the fingernails of him to see if he got physically close enough to maybe grab the suspect or anything like that. We didn't get any fingerprints that weren't supposed to be there. Jimmy's prints were the only ones there.
The report isn't all bad news for detectives.
An expert at Nike was able to determine the muddy shoe prints in the entryway of the house. Most likely came from a Nike Air Force One.
These are basketball-type shoes. They're between a size 10 and 11.
Before detectives can follow up on this new lead, their investigation takes a bizarre twist.
There had been a scandal at the high school.
Ridgeway High School had a very good basketball team. They were one of the top in the state. We started hearing about a student at the school who had just recently gotten in some trouble.
Detectives need to know if the scandal is linked to Jimmy's murder. Staff tells them the player at the center of the storm is number 22, Mackenzie Sewell.
Obviously, he was a fairly good basketball player, but he was also 2 years older than people that he was playing with. He was actually an adult, falsified documents to still play high school basketball because he was attempting to try to get a scholarship to play.
A week after Jimmy is found dead, the scandal explodes into the headlines.
This man used a fake transcript to enroll here at Ridgeway High, and our sources tell us the man has a GED, but enrolled here simply so he could play basketball.
A humiliated Mackenzie is kicked off the team and out of Ridgeway High.
The dream of the NBA is over. The coaches were like, oh my goodness, because the whole school gets punished for it. They get disqualified from being able to play.
The scandal raises a key question for detectives. Had Jimmy discovered the truth about Mackenzie and been silenced before he could report him to authorities?
Did Jimmy initiate this whole situation? Because we knew Jimmy was an ethical individual. If Mackenzie thought Jimmy had anything to do with this, then this could be a reason why Jimmy was murdered.
Police are eager to talk to Mackenzie, but that's not going to happen.
He immediately lawyered up. He didn't want to talk about anything.
Detectives try a different approach. They go to speak with the person who registered him at Ridgeway High, his mother, Chandra Nicole. What she tells them is more bizarre than they could have imagined.
What we found out is that was his wife.
Detectives hunting the killer of high school basketball coach Jimmy McClain are investigating whether a scandal involving one of his players is linked to his death. Now they discovered that the player's mother is actually his wife. She admits to helping Mackenzie falsify his age, but says it wasn't Jimmy who had discovered the deception.
She had actually called in to say that he was falsifying records, that he wasn't supposed to be in the school because they had gotten into an argument.
While enjoying his second go-around in high school, Mackenzie began a relationship with a fellow student. When his wife caught wind of it, she told the school about Mackenzie's scam.
It was a domestic situation between him and the wife. Really didn't have anything to do with Jimmy. Didn't fall on Jimmy at all.
Once again, a promising lead evaporates into thin air. And over a week into the investigation, police are starting over.
I was back to square one again. I was starting to question myself and wonder, are we gonna get anywhere with this thing?
I was starting to be concerned. I wanted to know when people were gonna be charged.
Just as investigators begin to fear the trail growing cold, they receive the complete cell phone records for Jimmy's ex-wife, Carla, and her daughter, Tiffany.
We had ordered direct cell phone records to corroborate the exact records that we had initially dumped. You're talking hundreds, even thousands of records at times to look through, to see if you can find where there's a discrepancy in something.
After days of hard work, police get the break they've been praying for.
Everybody else's phones were making sense, but Carla's phone did not make sense. We noticed there were actually people being texted between 6 and 9, 2 different phone numbers. And that was the time frame of the homicide. Those texts were conveniently erased off Carla's phone. So that automatically piqued interest. So we're trying to identify the 2 phone numbers that were deleted. We identified one of them as a subject named Robert and then another subject named Heather. We looked up Robert real quick and found out Robert was a convicted felon for dope dealing. But why are these numbers erased the night of the murder? At that point, I felt it necessary to call Carla back in and talk to her again, and then further identify maybe Heather and Robert since we had names on them.
When detectives press Carla about the texts, she tells them they belong to her son and Jimmy's former stepson, Dwayne. Detectives already know that Dwayne uses his mom's phone since he doesn't own one of his own.
Carla said that Heather was a girlfriend. She says, oh, she's a good girl. She's a girl that lives out in Cordova, not too far. Carla said wasn't too fond of Robert, but she did admit he and Dwayne were friends. She says, well, I don't really like him hanging out with Robert too much. You know, he's a troublemaker.
Knowing that Dwayne was texting with a known felon during the time frame of Jimmy's murder is a red flag for detectives. So they asked Dwayne to join his mom down at the station.
The way we approached Dwayne was like, hey, we're having to kind of start over and get a more detailed events of the night. And he advised when his mom got home, he had the phone, he spoke with one of his friends, and then Heather came over.
When detectives finish with Carla and Dwayne, they quickly contact Heather to see if she can confirm Dwayne's story.
She said, I went to Dwayne's house that evening, later that evening. So she has confirmed that she went over there.
It seems like it's another dead end. Yet when detectives follow up with a question about the basketball shoe print found at the crime scene, the interview takes a promising turn.
We asked about the shoes, and she said, oh, Dwayne has these Air Force Ones, and he wears a size 10.5, which fit the crime scene. And at that point, she said, and I remember seeing those Air Force Ones out on the porch, but I hadn't seen them since then. She said, I even have a picture of them. And when she showed a picture, it was a picture of Dwayne staying in the kitchen with a AR-15 rifle and these Air Force Ones.
Police quickly get a search warrant for Carla's home.
Searching the closets and everything else, so there's no Air Force Ones in there. There's no shoes that match the homicide. Took pictures of his room, and we left. We didn't come out at that house with anything.
So far, linking Dwayne to the crime has not proven fruitful, but detectives have another strategy.
We know for a fact that there was text messages between Robert and Dwayne during the homicide. We feel that those texts could be very important. Since he'd erased them off his phone, we couldn't get them. So my goal was to get a search warrant for Robert's phone, hoping that the text messages were still on his phone, visible where we could see them.
While police wait for a warrant to be approved, officers keep an eye on Robert.
I arrived, and within a few hours of setting up surveillance, Robert Collins came out of his house.
At that point, our detectives went to talk to him, and Robert took off running.
Detectives investigating the murder of Jimmy McClain believe text on the phone of convicted felon Robert Collins may point to the killer.
When Robert took off running, he ran a good ways, but we needed to catch him. We didn't want him to destroy his phone or anything like that.
As Robert Collins was running away from the scene, he tossed something.
Our detectives ended up catching him on foot, and when they did, he had a large amount of narcotics.
The illegal drugs give detectives reason to arrest Robert. But even more incriminating is what he tried to discard as he fled.
When we saw that he had tossed a weapon, we immediately thought maybe that was the weapon that was involved.
So in the back of my head, I'm thinking, oh, this is fantastic. Are we gonna solve the homicide right now? You get excited, like, hey, we're there, we're gonna get this.
Police bring Robert down to the station, but before they question him, they carefully examine his gun and phone.
I think it was very quickly determined it wasn't the weapon from the scene.
Still, detectives have plenty of leverage on Robert.
He's a felon convicted with a handgun. Now he's got another handgun on him and a large amount of drugs. This could easily go federal. maybe that could help us out. Maybe he'd want to work something out. He wouldn't budge on anything. I don't want to talk to y'all. Basically, he said, just put me in a jail cell. I'll go do my time. You just don't get that. That's just not normal.
Is Robert trying to protect his buddy, Dwayne, or just himself? If he won't give anything up, detectives hope his cell phone might.
I was hoping that the text messages were still on his phone. Started going through it. Well, Robert had erased his text too. But what Robert didn't erase were some pictures that we were able to get. The day before the homicide, Robert on his phone had a picture of a handgun. It is a similar gun, a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson Sigma, the same caliber used. What was unique about the handgun was not the handgun itself, but where the handgun was laying. And it was laying on a very unique bedspread. When I saw the bedspread, I was like, I've seen that bedspread before. I said, go get the search warrant pictures from when we picked Dwayne up. Well, as we scrolled through more pictures, we finally found a deleted picture that had Dwayne in front of the bedspread. So it tied it all in with the gun in the picture.
Police now know the gun likely belonged to Dwayne or someone in his inner circle. But who used it to gun Jimmy down in cold blood? Detectives hope to find out from Robert himself.
So when we put Robert in jail, we were hoping Robert would say something on the phone. The first phone call that Robert made was to a young guy. First thing that Robert said to the guy was, hey man, that pit bull, it's real sick. And the guy kind of like, I don't think he caught what he was saying. He's like, oh yeah, just laughing, I got you. And Robert, you could see was very frustrated, like, no man, I'm not kidding. You need to get rid of that pit bull, it's sick. Bri shouldn't have sold it to you. We did have indication that pit bull was most likely the gun.
And real sick, put it in street terms, means it has a body on it.
Detectives trace the owner of the phone Robert called.
It was a kid named Jamarius that lived in the Cordova area.
We believe that Jamarius Cooper had in his possession the firearm that was used in the killing of Jimmy McClain.
Police get an emergency search warrant and race over to Jamarius' home before he can dispose of the gun.
When we got Jamarius Cooper's bedroom, we systematically started going through places that things could be hidden.
We were going through it and we weren't finding anything. And then one of my detectives, probably into the 30th box or so, he's like, I got something. And I was like, do what?
When I saw that gun, I immediately felt like we had found the needle in the haystack. We had known through this investigation that most likely we were looking for a very specific gun. That is the same style gun that we're looking for. Same caliber, most likely the same brand, the same model.
At that moment, I was like, Jimmy's here, he's guiding us. He's telling us it's all here. He's not making it easy. he's making this puzzle, but it's slowly coming together. So immediately took the gun and had TBI process it. Within a couple hours, they were calling us back on, hey, this is the gun that was used in the homicide of Jimmy McClain. That does bring some emotion to you. Like, oh my gosh, this work, this time, and we're going into 30 days here. I mean, nobody finds a gun used in a homicide in 30 days.
Police need to talk to Jamarius, but before they can track him down, they get an alarming call.
We have a call from Cumberland County Sheriff's Office, and the deputy there said, hey, listen, we just had something weird come in. A white female came running into our station. She was very distraught. She was in her pajamas, and that she said that she wanted to pass on some information that her husband was upset because his nephew had admitted to killing a basketball coach.
Detectives investigating the murder of Jimmy McClain have just received an unexpected call from a sheriff's office 5 hours away.
And the deputy there said a white female came running into our station. Her husband was upset because his nephew had admitted to killing a basketball coach. Her husband was Carla's brother, which was Dwayne's uncle.
Detectives are stunned. Dwayne's uncle is Donald Page, a known felon. Detectives bring him in, knowing they may only have one shot to get him to talk.
He was very, I'm not talking to y'all, I ain't got nothing to say.
Police remind him of one simple fact. If he's withholding information, that makes him an accessory to murder.
And all of a sudden, he said, look, my nephew said he did it.
Dwayne had, in fact, taken him aside and said, Uncle, I had to handle my business. And Donald said he looked at him and said, are you saying that you killed him? Dwayne said to him, I had to stand up for my mom.
Dwayne, he loved his mom. They were having some financial issues, and Dwayne thought that if this divorce could just be done with, I could get the money from the house. And I think Dwayne took it upon himself to do whatever he wanted to do, and which unfortunately led to the homicide.
There was tension between Jimmy and Dwayne already. So there was that divorce, money, financial implication, motive.
With an accessory charge hanging over his head, Donald agrees to testify against his nephew.
At that point, I called the prosecutor and told him what we had, and he said, I think it's time to go lock up Dwayne Moore for homicide.
On March 26, 2013, Dwayne Moore is charged with the murder of his own stepfather.
I'm telling you, he just had no remorse, no confessions. He just didn't have any care in the world whatsoever.
When I heard Dwayne had been charged with Jimmy's murder, I felt a lot of relief.
I was shocked to know that someone that he had influenced this long in this young man's life that would take his life.
It went deep to my core as far as emotionally. This was unbelievable because of who Jimmy was.
14 months later, Dwayne Moore stands before the Memphis judge and jury. The prosecution lays out what they believe happened the night of the murder.
Dwayne had it in his head that he was going over there to kill him. He knew that there was a key to the house that Carla might have forgot about. I think he waited until he saw Jimmy pull in, let himself in that front door. Pulled the gun out as soon as he saw Jimmy and started shooting. I think he did it in about 5 minutes at the most. I think he just went in there and started blasting away.
To try to imagine what Jimmy must have gone through in the final moments that he was living is extremely painful. The awful terror he must have felt, knowing that his life was about to end.
On June 27, 2014, Dwayne Moore is convicted and sentenced to 22 years in prison without the possibility of parole.
It hurts. It hurts that somebody thought so little of my family, that they could take somebody so precious to us.
While Jimmy's family still misses him every day, his love for educating young people lives on.
To honor Jimmy's memory, we established a scholarship in his name at the University of Arkansas at Conway.
I think Jimmy would want to be remembered by being a godly man, a kind man, and a peaceful man.
That's what helps me to try to let the anger go. Don't be mad. Just thank God that he was here and that he was my brother for as long as he was. I miss him and I love him.
For more information on an unexpected killer, go to oxygen.com. A vibrant young woman making a fresh start in life.
My sister had a great sense of humor. She was just full of life and ideas and fun. She had a new graphic design job, a new relationship, a new place to live. She was looking to a new future.
Is mercilessly slaughtered in her home.
The person slit her throat.
It was a shocking murder.
Whomever the attacker was extremely disturbed.
You just can't register it. She didn't have any enemies. Everyone loved her.
Investigators tracked down multiple suspects.
There was a creepy guy just watching her.
There was a note that said, "Saw no signs of life."
Then police discover an enemy in disguise.
They were using other individuals to try to throw us off.
It was a bombshell.
Detectives unmask a killer no one could have imagined.
And I said, what? It didn't make any sense to me.
I was in complete shock.
Gulfport, Florida is an idyllic community, complete with sun, sand, and seaside charm.
Gulfport is kind of a classic southern town. It's kind of an arty community now.
Gulfport has a beautiful beach, and people are very friendly. I never felt unsafe living there.
On May 24th, 1984, Gulfport's laid-back lifestyle is shattered when a disturbing discovery is made.
A woman was checking on her neighbor, and when she didn't answer the door, she viewed inside one of the windows and saw a body laying in a pool of blood. And that's when she called 911.
Homicide detectives are sent to the address in Waterview Park.
Entering into the residence, I noticed broken glass, and I saw the victim's body. There was a copious amount of blood pooling around her head. She looked like she had been hit with a blunt object. There were several stab wounds up and around her neck area, like it was an attack of rage. The victim was partially clothed in a black teddy over a white t-shirt. It was kind of unusual for someone to wear a teddy on top of their t-shirt. It was unsnapped at the crotch. And so I had suspicions that she was sexually assaulted.
Even though the area was so gory, she had no blood on the soles of her feet. And that was important because you could see bloody footprints, and it appeared to be a barefoot as well.
We surmised that the perpetrator stepped in the blood after the attack was over.
The scene is so bloody, it's not yet clear what exactly happened. The body is sent for autopsy, while detectives continue surveying the home.
There was blood on the bed, blood smears on the drapes, and blood on the windowsill. Possibly the attack started in the bedroom area and then traversed over into the living room.
The trail of blood would indicate that she was fighting throughout. I think she was able to get away from her assailant and run through the house and open the door.
There was some blood and hair on the door, and it looks as though she was stopped, drugged back in, and then finished.
Upon examination of the residence, we couldn't find any type of weapon.
The crime scene was indicative of a very involved struggle, yet there was nothing knocked over or in disarray in the house. Now, it's possible that could actually happen that way, but it's also possible somebody went back in and cleaned it up.
Police speak with the woman who found the body. She tells them the victim is her neighbor, Karen Gregory.
She said the victim's boyfriend, David, was at a conference in Providence, Rhode Island. David had not heard from Karen, and so he called and asked if she would check to see if Karen was okay.
Born in Albany, New York in 1948, 36-year-old Karen Gregory was a loving and kind free spirit.
She was the center of attraction at any gathering, and people just loved her. Karen had a great sense of humor. She was a really good artist, had a great eye. She was a smart woman and very clever and witty and talented.
Karen loved to seek out new places and was always up for an adventure.
She traveled a lot. She would go to Jamaica and explore. And I think her ultimate goal was to go to Jamaica and teach art.
Before Karen can make her dream move, a chance meeting in Florida changes her plans.
And then she met David. David was an interesting character and probably a match for my sister's wit. He was very clever, very intelligent. David was a therapist for PTSD Vietnam vets, and they were just a really good match for each other. They were probably almost a year into the relationship where she had been visiting enough and staying there enough that it was time for her to move in with him. This was a new beginning. She had a new graphic design job, a new relationship, a new place to live, and I think she was looking to a new future. She had just moved in with David the day she was killed.
Who would take away Karen's life in such a horrific manner, and why? Detectives hope clues at the scene will point them to the killer.
Well, we found the Village Voice publication from Providence that struck us as really strange because David was supposed to be up there at the time.
That newspaper actually was dated the day that Karen could have been murdered.
Was David really in Providence, or had he returned? Before detectives can contact David to question him, they find another lead outside.
A note was placed on the car. The context of the note itself was quite telling.
It says, "Came by, I have something for you," but there was no sign of life. Rather brief note. But obviously, the no sign of life would, send up a red flag.
The note is signed by someone named Peter, but there's no other information, so police have no way to track him down. Officers collect the note as evidence, as Karen's family is notified of her death.
The day I got the call was just a beautiful, warm day. This isn't the kind of day that these things happen on. They had found my sister murdered. And I said, what? It didn't make any sense to me. And my mind just went through all of these situations to make that call impossible. And everything will be okay.
Police ask Karen's brother, Roy, about her relationship with David.
Karen's brother indicated that there was a little conflict between Karen and David in that Karen may have had an interest in another individual.
In Jamaica, she met a guy, and then she'd stay longer and longer on these trips. I think she was kind of torn maybe between both realities and both futures.
We also found out that Karen and David had broken up for a length of time before her death.
It wasn't some huge breakup, and she was still moving in, so we assumed everything was going to be worked out. But the weekend she was moving in is the weekend she was killed. The murder was at David's house, and I knew there was a rift there. So I think that added to maybe, well, you know, you just never know.
Could he have flown out to Providence and rebooked a flight back to Gulfport, committed the homicide, and then jumped back on a plane? We have to track down David. We felt that something was there behind the scenes, and we needed to find out about it.
Coming up, investigators discover a series of suspicious men in Karen's circle.
He had been physically abusive to his first wife.
He made Karen feel very uncomfortable.
And scramble to separate friend from foe.
Here we are building on a story that really raised red flags for us.
He's either protecting somebody or he's just flat out lying.
Until finally, the awful truth is revealed.
It makes me sick to my stomach.
No one would have ever thought that this person murdered this woman.
A day after 36-year-old Karen Gregory was brutally murdered in her home, police in Gulfport, Florida suspect her boyfriend, David Mackey, could have killed her, and they need to track him down.
Detectives found out that David was in Albany and that he had flew there to be with the family for the wake and funeral of Karen.
David Mackey seemed to be concerned about Karen, and he wanted to know what was going on. We weren't going to give David the investigative information that we had.
He said that he wasn't going to be back in Florida for another 2 weeks.
David promises to come down to the station when he is back in town. In the interim, investigators sent officers to canvass Karen's street.
Many of the neighbors heard a scream that night. Many got up and looked outside their windows and saw nothing. They didn't know exactly where it came from. Was it kids in a car? I mean, you know, they didn't really know.
The time of the scream was around 1 o'clock in the morning.
There's some thought the time of death was during the scream. She wasn't discovered until midday the day after that.
The head of the neighborhood watch is one of Karen's closest neighbors and a familiar face detectives can rely on.
George Lewis was a Gulfport firefighter, had grown up in Gulfport. All the police officers know him.
George and his wife, Linda, were very good friends with Detective Larry Tossi.
Well, having somebody like George to depend on was very, very comforting in that if something was going on in the neighborhood, he was that kind of neighborhood watch guy. George said that he was working in his garage, which was across the street from the murder scene. He said he heard a faint scream. He had the radio up loud. He even went out in the street, didn't see anything.
But George did see something the day before Karen's body was found.
George Lewis described seeing this guy pull up in his car and walk up to the door and then write a note and put it on the windshield of one of the cars.
Did George see Peter, the man who wrote that note?
He didn't know Peter Cutt. Was certainly something that the police wanted to look into because that was the only person they're aware of that went to the house during that time frame.
The next day, as police are figuring out how to track down Peter, they catch a lucky break.
In order to release the remains of the body, Karen's old roommate was asked to identify the victim. And at that time, she brought another person with her.
And he identified himself. It was Peter Cumble.
Investigators bring Peter in to answer some questions.
I noticed the scratch on his hand, thinking, you know, maybe it was done by Karen. He noticed me looking at it, so he moved his hand.
They asked him about that, and he said that his dog did it.
Peter confirms to detectives he is the one who left the note for Karen and says he was at the house around 7:30 p.m.
He had been invited to dinner by Karen. They'd known each other for maybe a year. They were both reggae music fans. He was bringing back a music tape, and that's what he was referring to when he said, "I have something of yours."
Not having anybody respond to the knock on the door, he just left the note and left. During the interview, he didn't seem very upset. Portraying that he was such a close friend to Karen, it kind of struck me as being, strange.
Detectives ask where Peter was when Karen was murdered.
Kumble's explanation for where he was that night was he was at home.
He did indicate that his roommate could verify that. He answered the questions, and he was amenable to whatever I asked him to do.
Peter provides police with his fingerprints and footprints, and while they let him go, detectives will keep an eye on him.
We weren't eliminating Peter Kumble from the investigation.
3 days after the murder, police received the medical examiner's report.
Karen had dozens of stab wounds on her. And it wasn't until they had cleaned her up they realized that the person slit her throat. Karen was tortured. The time of death was a day and a half before her body was discovered.
The report also confirms another disturbing fact.
The autopsy determined that a rape was involved.
The medical examiner found semen, but there wasn't enough to make comparison. And DNA at that time was in its infancy.
Thinking about what she went through, it makes me sick to my stomach. You just can't register it. She didn't have any enemies. Everyone loved her.
After 2 weeks out of state, Karen's boyfriend David returns to Florida and is immediately interviewed by detectives.
David was still very upset. He said he loved her and they were getting serious with each other, and she had finally found what she was looking for in life.
When detectives reveal they know he and Karen had issues, David brushes it off.
He repeated it was all good. They were in love with each other.
David claims the last time he saw Karen was the day he flew out of state.
Karen had driven David to the airport because he had a conference to attend in Providence.
Skeptical, detectives tell David they can place him back at the crime scene.
And I said, we found the Village Voice publication from Providence.
It was dated the night of the murder here in Gulfport.
He indicated to us he had purchased the Providence publication to check on the weather before he had left.
He told us it was at the newsstand in Gulfport a couple of days prior to the homicide. We have to look into that.
Detectives asked David point blank if he murdered his girlfriend.
He became frustrated, in my opinion, that we'd be looking at him instead of spending time looking for the real killer.
He was pretty adamant in the fact that he was off doing a conference in Providence and he hadn't gone anywhere. He said, I want to be as much of a help rather than a hindrance as I can. He was also asked to submit foot samples, which he did as well.
When asked who might want to kill his girlfriend, David gives a name detectives recognize.
David informed us that he felt that Peter Kumble had some kind of an interest in Karen.
It became clear that David was trying to blame this on Peter Kumble.
Police are investigating the grisly murder of Karen Gregory. Her boyfriend, David Mackey, denies being involved and points detectives towards Peter Kumble, a man police have already questioned and released.
In David's mind, he felt that Kumble was someone who had an interest in Karen, like as a potential girlfriend. David wasn't aware of anything about Kumble being invited to dinner and really probably had no real reason to see why Kumble would come by the house while he was gone. He said that Kumble was an acquaintance, but not a close friend. They knew people in the same circles.
Peter Kumble was always calling Karen up and that he felt he was going to try to develop a relationship with her, and Karen obviously wouldn't have anything to do with it.
David was concerned that Kumble could be involved, and they needed to look at him closely.
With nothing concrete to link David to the murder, they let him go. Detectives now need to confirm his claim that Peter had ulterior motives around Karen. When police try to bring Peter in for another interview, they hit a problem.
He had left Gulfport right after his first interview.
He had went on vacation, and the detectives found that strange, that him being close to Karen Gregory, that he would leave and go on vacation after her death.
Without the evidence to compel Peter to return, investigators switch gears and delve deeper into David Mackey's alibi. David had told police he had given a presentation in Providence at 9 a.m. on May 23rd, which would have been 8 hours after Karen was killed.
Was it possible for him to have got on a flight, come down, murdered Karen, and got back up to Rhode Island?
Detective Sergeant Tossi decided to take flights in the same time frame. I found that he could have committed the murder and get back in time and do his presentation. It would have been tight, but it's possible.
Detectives subpoena David's credit card information, but they show no record of David buying any additional flights. David's story about the newspaper also appears to check out.
It was discovered that the paper actually comes out 2 days early, and the gentleman remembered selling the paper to David Mackey. David was telling the truth, and his alibi was solid.
As weeks pass without an arrest, Karen's friends and family become concerned.
Not knowing why or who or how this even happened, you're left with all these questions. The grief was too heavy. There was just a lot of weeping for a long time. Just the slightest little memory of her or thought of her, I can weep right now thinking about that.
For such a small town, it was a shocking murder. I can only imagine what some of the women that lived alone in that community felt when there is a killer out there and they haven't been caught.
A few weeks into the investigation, detectives get a boost when potential suspect Peter Cumble arrives back in town.
He looked a little bit disheveled, he looked a little bit shaky, as if he didn't want to be there type of an attitude.
Detectives cut to the chase and ask Peter if he killed Karen Gregory.
He was completely shocked.
Cumble's alibi was he was at home.
But with David pointing the finger at Peter, detectives need to follow up.
He was pretty adamant in the fact that, he hadn't gone anywhere and the roommate could be his alibi witness. Anybody can say they're home and they're in bed. In the middle of the night, they can go out and do what they want to do. And that's a very shaky and unsubstantiated alibi. We didn't have much to hold him at that point, so he left.
Needing something concrete to tie Peter to the murder, investigators hope his footprint sample matches the one found at the scene.
There was a partial bloody footprint on the floor. We did send it off to the sheriff's office. And we waited quite a period of time, and then we heard back that they couldn't find any identifying ridges or swirls.
It's a big disappointment to me that our sheriff's office couldn't make a match.
Detectives refuse to give up.
The photograph of the bloody footprint looks mostly like a smear. So it was sent to Washington for the FBI to look at, which was not uncommon practice, especially if you had something that might be difficult for a local person to do.
The analysis won't be fast, so investigators go back through everything collected at the scene and find a potential piece of evidence.
There was a schematic drawing of a clock.
It appeared to have a blood stain on it. Did the murderer bring that with him and leave that there, forgetting about it? Did he get blood on it while this happened? So it looked like a pretty good clue they needed to follow up on. They were able to determine that these were schematics that had been drawn by Stephen Fischler, who was someone that Karen worked with.
Detectives send the blood on the drawing in for testing, and when they look into Stephen Fischler, they discover something troubling.
We found out from female workers that they felt uncomfortable around him, that he showed the girls pornography, and they took offense.
They indicated they were afraid of him.
According to one friend, Stephen Fischler made Karen feel very uncomfortable many times. He made unwanted advances. At one time, he gave her a provocative novel that he was writing.
Fischler, as far as the way he behaved in the office around women, he was a suspect.
We decided that we needed to have an extensive interview with Stephen Fischler. Stephen Fischler had kind of a defensive attitude. He was curt.
He said that they didn't really know each other. He and Karen had seen each other at work, but she had only been working there a short period of time.
When Stephen was questioned about the schematic, he had no explanation for how it got into her house, other than she probably took it home with her.
Detectives grill Stephen about his reputation among his coworkers.
And he became angry. He says, I had no idea.
We asked him if we'd take a polygraph test. He agreed to do that. Stephen didn't really want to answer the questions. He was extremely frustrated.
Just when investigators think they won't get anything out of him, Stephen says something truly shocking.
During the polygraph, he blurted out, "Okay, I did it."
Everybody thought, well, heck, this guy is confessing.
Two months after Karen Gregory is viciously slaughtered in her home, her coworker Stephen Fischler has just confessed to police.
It was unexpected. Was he really telling the truth?
Police immediately begin to press Stephen for details behind his confession.
We determined that after talking with Stephen, that he blurted out, "Okay, I did it," just out of frustration.
He was angry because he was being accused of this murder. And that was just his personality and his temperament.
Stephen retracts his confession and proceeds with the polygraph.
He passed the polygraph. It showed no deception indicated.
The result was totally unexpected to us. It basically cleared Fischler.
But Stephen's not off the suspect list just yet. He refuses to provide a footprint sample, so police must wait for the results from the schematic drawing to see if any foreign blood is detected.
In this case, the blood was clearly all her blood, and it wasn't Stephen Fischler's. There was a lot of frustration. It kind of hit a dead end.
Running out of suspects, investigators switch up their approach and put together a behavioral analysis profile of the killer.
You're trying to look at, what causes people to do what they might do.
It wasn't your general whodunit. Whomever the attacker was extremely disturbed. He was the type of individual that had various fantasies, sexual fantasies, which drove him to commit the murder of Karen Gregory.
Maybe this was a serial killer, which kind of fits into that whole psychological pattern to some degree.
It was probably the most difficult case that I had to deal with. 5 months down the road from the homicide, I just couldn't let the case go, couldn't put it on the shelf.
For Karen's family, coping with the reality that her killer may never be found is overwhelming.
We kind of thought they're never going to solve this, which was just alarming to us. And that's another whole kind of pain. It was a nightmare. She was a sweet, wonderful young woman. And the killer was a brute, who butchered her.
Finally, a break comes in December, 5 months after the murder, when detectives make a discovery that revitalizes the case.
Tassi was talking to a person who lived a few blocks away from Karen, and that person told him they had heard the scream. She described it as just a wail, and that it was very disturbing. Tassi was like, he didn't realize it was really that loud that actually over 2 or 3 blocks people heard this.
This new information is in direct conflict with the statements of the neighborhood watch head.
She's several blocks away and she hears the scream, and George is right across the street. How come he didn't hear more than what he said was a faint scream? It didn't make any sense. So we figured we better have another talk with George, which we did.
Detective Tassi, he looked at George as a helper to the police case. George was a firefighter, the neighborhood watch guy that was actively out there.
When we went over his story, he indicated that he had heard the scream, and that he walked to the edge of his driveway, looked around and didn't see anything.
Now, George adds a new detail to his account.
Now he sees somebody on the lawn under the big oak tree.
This story was quite a surprise. Why didn't he report it? Why didn't he call?
He didn't really know what to say. I think in many ways he sounded nervous.
George describes the person he saw the night of the murder.
He said he was like 6'4" and had red sandy hair. He was a big, strong-looking guy. It was certainly something that the police wanted to look into.
Armed with the new information, detectives try to track down this mysterious man.
And in doing extensive neighborhood interviews, it was related to us there may be a peeping Tom in the area that fit. We thought, well, we may have something to go on here.
I interviewed one person, and she said that she had a peeping Tom at her window. And when she noticed him, he took off.
Could the peeping Tom be the killer police have been looking for? Investigators showed George pictures of possible prowlers.
He couldn't identify any of them. So the mystery man in the lawn remained unidentified.
So there's some thought that he might have been watching that house and watching her and knew that she was alone that night and knew David was out of town.
I felt terrified, especially at night. I kept my doors locked. I didn't want to end up like her.
Detectives find another woman in the neighborhood who recently saw the prowler.
There was a creepy guy just watching her for some unknown reason.
She caught him peeping in the window, and he took off.
The woman recognized the man. When she tells police his name, they're stunned.
It was a big surprise.
Detectives hunting for Karen Gregory's killer learn there's a prowler stalking the women of Gulfport, Florida. Could the offender be one and the same? When a victim of the voyeur comes forward with a name, investigators are shocked.
It's the neighbor, George Lewis.
It was totally unexpected to us.
Detectives bring George in for a third time and ask him about the woman's claims.
He admitted he was outside the house, and he had some explanation for why he was there. He was a neighborhood watch guy and always looking out for people. He said he heard a noise or something. He thought, you know, is it possible it's the killer?
He was given the opportunity to take a polygraph test, which he did.
Detectives start by asking about the prowler.
Listening to the polygraph tape and how George Lewis described the man, I really believed him.
Investigators also ask him about the night of the murder.
Did you kill Karen Gregory? George said no.
The polygraph results tell a different story.
The results were disastrous. He failed it miserably.
After he failed it, he had something else to say about the night of the murder.
George admits he hasn't been completely honest and tells police that's why he didn't pass the polygraph.
George Lewis indicated to us the individual that he saw on the lawn left Karen's house itself. He saw George and had approached him and threatened him.
The person walks out and tells him, if you say you saw me here, I'll come back and kill you.
So that's the reason he wasn't forthcoming. He was afraid of him. George Lewis went from just hearing a scream at the edge of his driveway to indicating that he saw the perpetrator.
And then his next story, George said this guy threatened him.
We were very concerned about that because here we are building on a story, so it really raised red flags for us. We felt that, you know, with the abundance of different issues and stories he was telling, he was using other individuals to try to throw us off. We had asked him to do a composite sketch of the individual that he saw. After the sketch was done, we both looked at each other and said, this really can't be happening. We both came to the conclusion it was George when he was younger.
I think he thought the police had a witness who saw somebody in Karen's yard. So he was making this description of the person who scared him get closer and closer to looking like him.
He's either protecting somebody that he knows, or he's just flat out lying. We have to look at George a little closer.
Investigators collect his foot and fingerprints, but with little hard evidence to hold him, George is released. Detectives take a deep dive into George's past and make some disturbing discoveries.
He had been physically abusive to his first wife.
According to her, there were times when he had been violent with her. He had choked her. The crime itself shows some pretty deep-seated violence towards women, and I think there was aspects in his background where you could see that.
George had gotten into a swingers club. That was a part of George I never really saw, you know, or never knew. He's never said anything like that to me. So that was kind of surprising, but things were building up with him and his behavior.
It appears George developed a troubling fascination with Karen before she had even moved in.
One of George's friends told me that Karen was visiting over at David's house. Karen had come out in a bikini, and he made some comment about liking to have an orgy with her. Got aroused. He had gotten into sexual perversions, if you will.
I think there was indications that he was, you know, a peeper of some sort.
Still looking for hard proof, detectives asked George's wife about the night of the murder.
She was woken by the scream. After just a few minutes, George came in from the garage.
The killer would have been covered in blood, but George wasn't.
When you sit back and you look at these things, could you say to yourself, oh, well, maybe he really didn't do it. Maybe his story makes sense. Or maybe he's covering up for somebody that did do it, you know what I mean?
And so now it's, you know, where do we go from here?
At that time, we didn't have, you know, DNA. The only thing that could tie itself into the case was the footprints.
Detectives are still waiting for those results.
It was getting extremely, extremely frustrating for the team.
And then the months just went by, you know, nothing happened.
It seemed like it was just going to be a cold case. And it's like, well, what are we supposed to do with that? You know, you can't just stop here, but they didn't have leads. They didn't know where to go with it. This is about my sister being butchered to death. We were not going to rest till they found who the killer was.
In March 1986, almost 2 years after Karen's murder, the FBI finally finished their analysis on the bloody footprint at the crime scene.
The day that the data came back from the FBI, everybody was elated.
It showed the ridges on the heel from the bare foot, and they can be identified, compare one to someone else.
Detectives have renewed hope the killer is within their reach.
We must have sent 20 sets of footprints.
And they got a result on that relatively quick, which changed the whole case.
A definite match.
No one in Gulfport would have ever thought that this person murdered this woman.
Nearly 2 years since the brutal slaying of Karen Gregory, detectives have just received a report back on the bloody footprint found at the crime scene.
The footprint was sent to the FBI. We're waiting specifically on just that result.
There was a definite match of a footprint of George Lewis to the inked footprint that we had sent up there to the FBI lab.
It was shocking.
It was very hard for me to believe that George Lewis murdered Karen Gregory. He was the head of the crime watch. He was a firefighter. I was in complete shock.
Although no one could believe George was a cold-blooded killer, the evidence doesn't lie.
Footprints with their ridges and their swirls are similar to fingerprints. If you have enough of those patterns, to present to a match, then they're just as good.
I didn't want to believe it, and I had to face that. I trusted George. He was toying with me. He certainly wasn't the person that I thought he was.
The detective knows he has to ask his old friend some tough questions.
We asked him to come into the station, and that's when we confronted him with the footprint. That's when he said, I crawled in the window.
It was a bombshell. Now here's a whole new story where he's absolutely in the house.
He indicated that he had heard the scream. He had gone through the bedroom window to try to assist Karen.
He said that he saw her laying there with her throat cut open. Only the killer would have known that her throat was cut.
He said he had stepped in the blood to assist her or help her, and then he had exited out through the bedroom window.
His explanations didn't make sense. If you assume that his story is true, that he was threatened by this person in the yard and was too scared to do anything about it, then why would he go into the house?
Why didn't he call police at that time?
His story is BS, but the nail in the coffin, of course, was the footprint.
Investigators also talked to George's wife again, and they learned he would have had time to clean up after the crime.
His wife had been very defensive of him. Then she changed the story. George was gone for the longest time, she said, 20 minutes or more.
We don't have to prove motive. We felt we had enough probable cause then to make an arrest.
I had mixed feelings. I was sorry it was George, but yet I was a little upset that he just led us on.
Nearly 2 years after Karen's brutal murder, on March 15th, 1986, George is charged with first-degree murder and sexual battery.
It was a huge relief that they had finally found someone, but it was a shock, just a shock, and still no reason why would a neighbor do this.
I think in looking at him, it was pretty clear that he had a fairly misogynistic view towards women. He thought she might be an easy mark or an easy target.
At trial, investigators put forward their theory about how the murder unfolded.
George Lewis would have gone over knowing that David was out of town. He came in the house, knifed, and ready to do it, and was living out a fantasy. Teddy had been put on her against her will.
She knew that the only way to get away was fight to get out of that residence.
She was pushed and hit her head against the jalousie windows. That's when she screamed. After that, it got really violent. The rape was involved.
Lewis knew then that he had only one way to go with this, and as a result, he ends up stabbing Karen 21 times.
George Lewis maintains his innocence, but a jury convicts him, and he is sentenced to life without the possibility of parole.
No one ever really wants to believe that someone that is there to protect and to serve could do something so horrible.
This was really unexpected that he was the killer. That didn't seem like who I would expect a firefighter to be, and certainly not the neighborhood watch guy. Although maybe he was watching for opportunities.
I was relieved we could actually get justice for Karen and all the people who loved her.
There was a little bit of justice in knowing he was in jail. My sister probably would have forgiven him. That's the kind of person she was. It's funny sitting here now. She was alive for as many years as she's now been gone. She never lived, we never got to know who she'd be as an old lady. She was just full of life and ideas and fun and humor. I have her ring on right now that she made for me. Karen and I were really close. And I'll always miss that. And I'll just never forget her.